In the landscape of horror and unyielding nightmares in both movies and games, Capcom's Resident Evil, or Biohazard as known in Japan, opens up a Pandora's box that breaks away from the confines of a simplistic experience that a lot of media presents.
Stars.
It's not chained to a single genre or reliant on a cheap scare. Instead, it entices us to face elements that challenge our bravery and courage to overcome our fears. It's not afraid to break the meta-narratives in many aspects neither. And Resident Evil has forever changed how we perceive video games. It introduced us to the concept of surviving the horrific, changing the landscape of gaming by showing the desperate need to overcome the odds for basic human instinct to live another day. It's about facing not just our own fears, but also the byproducts of our creations of our own design.
My precious G-Virus. No one will ever take you away from me.
Facing that voice within that makes us doubt ourselves, and standing up to the monsters in our way.
Look out! It's a monster!
Let me take care of it!
From the original experiences to the reinventions of the series, it offers a new perspective while retaining the elements of its predecessors. The remakes create a whole new nightmare of their own that some naturally gravitate towards, as they encapsulate an era of brooding, nightmarish creativity rather than a modernised experience that might soften the feeling of survival and overcoming terror. But there's no denying that some of these remakes have elevated the experience, trapping us in the twilight zone of horror once again in a more visually horrific setting. And then the shift from third-person perspective with those awkward camera angles where we question what lurked around every corner. From a simple sound to the first-person view has changed how we perceive horror in games. It makes the surrounding horrors feel more real and unnerving, placing us right into the nightmare as if we are truly in the scenario, with our inner selves screaming for survival once more. Shinji Mikami's vision of first person in this series makes it feel true to its original concepts.
Hey, put that door back! Put that door back up! Wait!
Even Resident Evil 8 takes inspiration from the best in the series, combining survival horror elements of Resident Evil 1 with the action-packed gameplay of Resident Evil 4. It merges as upgradable features with a gripping storyline, creating the perfect balance that pays tribute to its predecessors. Capcom's creativity really knows no bounds, whether it's putting us into a fight for survival in horror or throwing us into a full-blown action combat ready for war. These are moments in time we'll never forget, from the brave heroines.
Leave this mess to him. He's a professional.
So am I.
How are you doing?
You know, just surviving.
And all the way to our headstrong soldiers.
All of it. 3 years trying to put this thing in the ground. 3 years too long.
You stay on the door. I got this fucker.
And finally, all the way to the stoic and charismatic agents.
And sadly, the speaker for our Lord.
Tell someone who gives a shit.
Whatever role we take on, it's undeniably Resident Evil. And the great tale began years ago when the series was first conceived in the early 1990s. The development began in 1993 with Shinji Mikami leading the project under Capcom. All inspired by Capcom's earlier game Sweet Home in 1989, which was based on a horror movie out at the same time. Resident Evil was envisioned as more a modern 3D survival horror game. The concept aimed to bring the tension and the scares of classic horror movies into a video game format, making use of the PlayStation's advanced hardware to deliver a creepy, immersive experience. The game was officially released in 1996 for the PlayStation and would change the way that we would see horror games forever.
Resident Evil.
Production of Resident Evil started back in '93. Capcom's Tokugawa Fujiwara approached Shinji Mikami and his team, telling them to create a game using elements from Fujiwara's earlier game, Sweet Home, on the Famicom. Now, if you know anything about Sweet Home, you'll see just how much Resident Evil was influenced by it. By the late 1994, as Capcom was getting ready to bring around Biohazard to the US, they ran into a snag. The name Biohazard was already taken. A DOS game known as Bio Menace and a hardcore punk band both claimed the name. So Capcom held a contest among the team and came up with something new, and that's how we ended up with Resident Evil in the West. Shinji Mikami, the director of Resident Evil, was actually not happy with the name Resident Evil. He thought it was a bit cheesy and didn't fully capture the essence of the game. He preferred the original title Biohazard because it felt like it best represented the themes of biological horror and the virus-driven storyline. With the game finally debuting on PlayStation in '96, would later be ported to the Sega Saturn, but it went through several redesigns before it got there. Initially it was planned as a Super NES game in '93, then switched to a fully 3D first-person game for PlayStation in '94, and finally landed as the third-person survival horror we know today. Like the inventory system, save system, and vitals monitor, were first introduced here. These became staples not just for the series, but the entire survival horror genre. Being inspired by Sweet Home, you had the limited inventory, the iconic mansion setting, solving puzzles, survival being the main focus, and even the door loading screens that build tension. Storytelling was handled through scattered notes and diaries, just all like in Sweet Home. And let's not forget the multiple endings, which depended on how many characters you saved, and the backtracking to solving puzzles later on. A lot of brutal, horrific imagery and death animations were also borrowed from Sweet Home. The game even used specific character items like the lockpick or lighter, which became a part of the overall puzzle-solving dynamic. One of the key inspirations for limited ammo in Resident Evil came from the MSX game Alcazar. Alcazar the Forgotten Fortress, according to Kenichi Ueno, the scenario writer, the idea for limited ammo came from Alcazar's randomized dungeons with scarce supplies. Ueno wanted to incorporate even more survival elements like attacking zombies with mines and traps, but the schedule didn't really allow it. Development for Resident Evil did start in '93, and it took about 3 years to complete. Shinji Mikami spent the next first 6 months working solo, isolated, designing characters, sketching concepts, and even writing over 40 pages of the script. And it was all at that time that Koji Oda had worked on Super Ghouls and Ghosts, and he was involved in developing the Super NES version, which was going to have more of a hellish setting before it changed to a more realistic mansion we know today on the PlayStation 1. But we can see how Resident Evil takes its inspiration from games like Ghosts and Ghouls, even particularly with its backgrounds and settings. It does look very similar. Capcom is not afraid to reach in the past and draw for inspiration off its previous titles, reinventing itself essentially. At one point there was even a first-person prototype with a style more like Doom than Alone in the Dark. However, when Mikami discovered Alone in the Dark during production, it completely changed the direction of the game. he decided to adopt a fixed-view cinematic camera style like Alone in the Dark. Mikami initially hesitated with this choice because he felt it might reduce immersion and make the player feel detached, but the benefits of pre-rendered backdrops which allowed more detailed environments ultimately won him over. If it wasn't for Alone in the Dark, we might have seen Resident Evil as a first-person game, instead of the third-person style it eventually ended up with. And speaking of the first person, that perspective didn't make a return to the main series up until Resident Evil 7 Biohazard in 2017, and so forth with Resident Evil 8, so you can see how far back these ideas go.
Alone in the Dark 見て、あ、プリレンダーで背景1枚にしたら十分いけるし。
The original Resident Evil used pre-rendered backgrounds to achieve a level of visual detail that wasn't possible with fully 3D environments on the PlayStation hardware. These backgrounds were essentially detailed, static images that represented the game's environments. Since the PlayStation couldn't handle rendering highly detailed 3D graphics in real time, the developers used the pre-rendered images to simulate intricate environments while keeping performance manageable. The characters and objects you interact with, like doors and items, were rendered in 3D and placed over 2D images, giving the illusion of a fully realised world. This approach set the tone for the atmosphere in Resident Evil. These static angles provided an unnerving experience because they didn't move you, unlike modern games with free cameras. Every time you entered a room, the fixed angle meant you couldn't always see what was lurking around the corner or off-screen. You'd hear the unsettling sound of footsteps, groans and moans, but you wouldn't know where the enemy was until it was too late. It forced you to be cautious, amplifying the suspense. Then there's the tank controls for those unfamiliar. Tank controls are when the character moves relative to their orientation, not the camera. Pressing forward on the D-pad would always move the character forward in the direction they are facing, regardless of where the camera was. For players, this was cumbersome at first, making movement feel rigid and slow. Shinji Mikami, the game's director, was actually embarrassed by how clunky the tank controls felt. It wasn't the smoothest way to navigate, and even admitted himself it felt awkward. However, in a strange twist, those tank controls became a part of what made Resident Evil so intense. Players had to think carefully about movement. The slow turn speeds combined with fixed camera angles left you feeling vulnerable, heightening the fear, as you could essentially run directly into the arms of a zombie. You couldn't just spin around and run like in traditional shooters. You had to commit to your choices, making every encounter with a zombie or monster feel like it was a life or death situation. Mikami wasn't alone in feeling uncertain about this. Many players thought that the control scheme was a misstep, but as the feedback rolled in, players praised the tension it created. It wasn't an accident anymore, it was now a feature that elevated the horror, and the lack of control made you feel like you were genuinely trapped in the mansion, fighting to survive. Essentially, you was either in fight or flight mode, and that's the brilliance of this game. My first aim, Mikami recalls, was to create something that could provide the scariness of an amusement park haunted house at home. For me, the things I've always been scared of the most are ghosts, so I was considering producing a game full of evil spirits. Thinking about it though, in the capacity of a game, there wouldn't be any feeling of exhilaration if you were shooting at or attacking ghosts. When I realised that during the initial planning stages of the development, I decided to scrap the ghost idea and find a different type of enemy threat." End quote. Mikami right from the start wanted to create something that could terrify you, but also make you feel empowered. He recognised that ghosts, though scary, just wouldn't give the players the same satisfaction of survival that a more tangible enemy would. There wouldn't be that physicality, that exhilaration of fighting back, that grounded sense of danger that pushes you to survive. He had this haunted house concept in mind, but realised it needed something more visceral. He went back to the drawing board, searching for that key element that would bring his vision to life. And then of course that's when it hit him, zombies. Mikami saw zombies as the perfect adversary, inspired by his love for Dawn of the Dead, a zombie movie. The idea of fighting human-like creatures, twisted by infection and driven by primal instinct, was the ideal way to give the players a sense of dread while also giving them a shot at survival, something horror movies didn't offer their audiences. The first 6 months of development, Mikami explains, I was the team. 6 months down the line, I was joined by another planner. But after 3 months of working together, he left to do development work on another project. From month 9 onwards, the number of personnel suddenly increased to 15, and from that time on, the team gradually increased in the number until towards the end of development. We had more than 50 people working on Biohazard. End quote. It's wild to think that for half of a year, Mikami was essentially building Resident Evil on his own, with only one other person stepping in later for a short while. The whole idea of the game was in his hands, and those first 6 months laid the groundwork for what would become a legendary franchise. After those initial hurdles, the project began to grow, attracting more talent as development ramped up. Mikami goes on to highlight the key players who shaped the game into what we now know. On the planning and design front, Resident Evil had Hideki Kamiya and Hiroko Kaito and Kazunori Kodoi as the Cause trio. These three formed the foundation of the game's creative direction, and their collaboration was crucial in establishing the game's design principles. Kamiya, who would later go on to direct Resident Evil 2, was pivotal in the series in the early days. In terms of the visuals, Jin Takushi handled character animation, while Motoji Fujita and Ippai Masuda took charge of the background rendering, bringing the eerie atmosphere of the Spencer Mansion to life. Their work was instrumental in creating the claustrophobic, haunting environment that Resident Evil is known for. Every shadow, every dimly lit corridor, all that dread you felt creeping in as you explored was crafted by these talented artists. Programming and system development, on the other hand, was spearheaded by Yasuhiro Ampo. He laid down the technical groundwork that made the gameplay systems click, allowing for that tense, deliberate pacing that Resident Evil is famous for. Katsutoshi Karatsuma worked on gameplay features, making sure the mechanics felt solid, whilst Kayohiko Sakata focused on in-game events, the moments that drew you into the narrative. And finally, Ippo Yamada was responsible for the sound, which, let's be honest, is half of the horror experience. Those chilling sound effects, the unnerving silence followed by sudden shrieks, and the eerie music all played a crucial role in creating the perfect survival horror atmosphere. Ippo states he was responsible for making everything we can hear in the game, together with Hideki Utsumai and 2 other colleagues who created all the sounds in the game. Ippo mentions that there was no real gunshot sounds that are recorded, but however he designed a basic sound compared to a conventional gunshot effect. He thought it would produce a sense of realism, then the non-flashy sound would also produce a sense of anxiety, a fear that players could not rely on the gun alone, that the gun may be unreliable. He felt like the sound of a single gunshot echoing in the quiet, and the sound of the shell casing bouncing on the floor created that sense of dread. When asked about if he remembers what staff members were used for the zombie voices and if he himself took part, Ippo explains the zombie noises were the voices of our development team in the sound room. Mikami-san is actually Mr. Paruk on the first floor. I decided which voices would go with which rooms, but I do not remember more specific details and did not use my own voice. When asked who is Mr. Paruk, he says, "I'm sorry, it was a nickname. It was the first zombie that appears on the first floor, with a cutscene of it looking back at you." Paruk is a brand name for fluorescent tubes manufactured by Panasonic. The zombie that appears and turns around is like a light bulb. That is where the nickname originates. When asked about if he met with Shinji Mikami when he first joined the Resident Evil team, and did he work with any other members of the development team prior to working on Resident Evil, Ippo responds saying, "No, Biohazard was an IP with many rookie designers, and for the first time that he worked with Mikami-san was on Aladdin, on the Famicom, one of Mikami's first games." And when asked did he work on the Sega Saturn version of Resident Evil, Ippo replies, "No, I was doing this before I was involved with Biohazard. I was doing research unrelated to that." Whilst in question, it was asked that did he actually work on the Sega Saturn version of Resident Evil in any capacity, in which Ippo responds saying, "No, I had already left Capcom when the project had started. It's a pity because I was studying the Saturn comprehensively whilst I was at Capcom." Eventually, he would depart from the company in 1996 following his work on Resident Evil, but wouldn't wind up straying too far from it. Altogether in Resident Evil 1 there is 550 sound effects all placed meticulously in areas well suited for a different horror experience every single time. It is the soul of the series.
ほとんどの人がバイオハザードっていうブランドを知ってる。で、なんとなくまあ怖いゲームだっていうことも知ってる中で。
Once the central team was in place, Capcom's production studio 4 wasted no time transforming Mikami's concept into something playable. Early on, the team experimented with the over-the-shoulder camera system, an idea that would eventually be perfected in Resident Evil 4. However, it quickly became clear that the PlayStation hardware wasn't capable of handling such a demanding design, at least not in 1995. At the time, the over-the-shoulder perspective required more processing power than the PlayStation could offer, especially with the game's focus on detailed environments and character animations. The limitations of the hardware forced the team to re-evaluate the game's direction. What seemed like a setback turned into a blessing. Mikami admitted that Biohazard was far from beautiful, in the traditional sense, especially by today's standards. Back in the day, developing for the PlayStation hardware came with its challenges. Originally the game was supposed to be fully 3D, but they quickly realised that the PlayStation just couldn't handle it, so they switched to these pre-rendered environments, which allowed them to achieve the visual quality that they wanted overall. The downside was that it made the controls less fluid, and they had to cut down on the polygon counts to make the characters work within those limits. Mikami mentioned something interesting. Biohazard could have taken a humorous turn if there had been more development time. He had an idea where after 3 weeks of gameplay the game would shift into a comedy, but the concept was scrapped due to time constraints. Mikami saw a connection between horror and comedy, thinking both genres shared common ground. While this idea never made it into the game, his vision of Biohazard was mostly realised in other ways. There were some comedic features in the original Resident Evil that would have come from Shinji Mikami's original concepts.
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
You're right.
Regardless of Mikami's decision not to turn Biohazard into the video game equal to a slapstick comedy, which is probably a wise decision, his vision of how he wanted the game to be largely realised was at the top of his list of the favourite things about Biohazard, ranging from absolutely everything that we ourselves even enjoyed and what made Resident Evil 1 such a classic. All of these elements such as tension, puzzles, item location tasks, the excellent FMV cutscenes and the associated charismatic voice acting of the game's characters combined to produce an experience that was a little different from other attempts at the genre. Mikami's career path going from working on a few Disney licensed SNES games to producing a next-gen horror game might seem unusual, but he has always been a fan of darker entertainment. Shinji Mikami recalls the tough but oddly enjoyable atmosphere during the final stages of Biohazard's development at Capcom's production studio 4. As development intensified, the challenges led to several staff resignations. One by one, staff would resign because developing Biohazard was too difficult for them, Mikami shares. Despite this, those who remained worked around the clock, even pushing development tools beyond their limits. It was a feverish atmosphere in the team, Mikami reflects. The final 6 months were particularly intense, Mikami remembers. To quote Mikami, it was super hard work until 3 AM every night. The team was mostly living at work, but amidst the chaos there was room for fun. At night our spirits were really high. People would run around the development floor, pushing others in sitting chairs into elevators shouting sayonara before sending them to random floors. Mikami laughs. End quote. Yet behind the laughter, Mikami was aware of the mounting pressure on Capcom. The company had no major investors to fall back on, unlike Sega or Namco. The threat of bankruptcy loomed. To quote Mikami, "I knew that if Biohazard wasn't a big success, There was a danger that Capcom would face bankruptcy, he reveals. End quote. While the rest of the team celebrated the game's completion, Mikami felt relief and exhaustion, realizing the weight of the responsibility he carried for such a big project. During Resident Evil's development, one of the most intriguing ideas that almost made it into the final game was cooperative gameplay. At one point you could play alongside another character, adding an entirely different dynamic to the survival horror experience. Imagine facing the horrors of the Spencer Mansion, not alone but with a friend, helping each other fight off zombies or solve puzzles. Early footage from '95 even revealed this co-op prototype, complete with different character outfits, but ultimately Mikami decided to cut this feature, admitting that technically it wasn't good enough. At that point in gaming history, co-op would have been groundbreaking for a survival horror game like Resident Evil, but technical limitations meant they couldn't get it to feel just right. Could you imagine having to try and maneuver both players through these cramped, tension-filled hallways? That could have been so terrifying and chaotic, maybe even both. Capcom even showcased an early demo at the 1995 V-Jump Festival in Japan, which featured the ability to swap weapons in real time, a feature that was also scrapped before the game was released. The demo had rudimentary character models and textures, showing just how early in development the game still was. By the time we got to see a '96 preview in Maximum Console Gaming magazine, we saw significant changes. This preview showed a graveyard area and a slightly different final boss than the one we eventually fought in the finished game. The graveyard, though cut from the original game, did make its way into the 2002 remake, giving fans a taste of what might have been. Other planned locations like the guest house and a tower were replaced by the guardhouse and the lab, locations now ingrained in the memory of any Resident Evil fan. These early concepts give the game a slightly different tone, one more in line with its original haunted house inspiration, but in true Capcom fashion. They knew what worked best for gameplay, and the final cut became the iconic layout we know now. Interestingly, despite owning a motion capture studio at the time, Capcom didn't use it during development. Instead, animators had to get creative, studying books and videos to realistically animate how people, and even creatures like spiders, moved. The zombies, the way they lurch forward, the horrifying twitch of a spider, or the Cerberus dog jumping through the windows, all animated by hand without motion capture. This painstaking process added a lot of unsettling nature of the game's creatures, making them feel unnatural and terrifying in their movements. Resident Evil 0.5, sometimes referred to as Biohazard 0.5, is one of those fascinating what-if moments in gaming history. It was the early blueprint for what would eventually become Resident Evil, a game that changed the landscape of survival horror forever. It's this beta phase that never saw an official release, existing only in the form of early ideas and prototypes that were buried deep in Capcom's archives. However, passionate fans, modders and dedicated enthusiasts have been able to reconstruct parts of this unreleased prototype. One of the key figures behind these efforts is El Rincon del Lobizno, a modder who meticulously recreated environments and enemies based on early concept art and sketches. Thanks to their dedication, elements of Lost Beta can now be experienced by others, offering an intriguing peek into Capcom's early experimentation. I'll leave the link down below if you guys want to get set up with this if you're on PC. The Resident Evil community has always been enthralled by these beta versions, with modders and fans tirelessly reconstructing and sharing content that was never meant to see the light of day. One of those most striking differences between Resident Evil 0.5 and the final game is that it wasn't going to use the now iconic pre-rendered backgrounds. Instead, Capcom initially toyed with the idea of using more dynamic real-time environments, which would have given the mansion even more immersive, exploratory feel. The modders behind this have really dug deep into Capcom's original scripts and concepts, revealing just how different the game could have been. For instance, in this early version, Jill acted more like a buddy character, following Chris throughout the mansion, which is a noticeable shift from the final game's dynamic where Barry plays a supportive role. In the dining hall, there are dead zombies scattered around with items laid bare on the ground, offering a much more cluttered and chaotic scene than the more polished version in the official release. This change not only alters the atmosphere, but would have affected how players scavenged for supplies earlier on. Another striking difference is in the hallway where Kenneth Sullivan, or Carlisle in the beta, who's found half-eaten by a zombie, actually drops a handgun that players can pick up. This contrasts sharply with the final version, where Chris finds Jill's gun instead, and Jill herself starts with a weapon. The beta seems to have been leaned more heavily in the exploration and scavenging areas, where the player had to piece together weapons and items in ways that felt more organic, adding a different layer to the survival mechanics. And in Resident Evil in 1996, when playing as Chris or Jill, Kenneth and Sullivan actually drops clips of handgun ammo on the ground for us to collect. The beta concepts are very different from the original release. The mansion itself, the iconic Spencer Mansion, wasn't even fully fleshed out in Resident Evil 0.5. Early sketches and concept art showed different layouts, paths through the forest, and even a cemetery, all of which didn't make it into the final release, but as mentioned, the beauty of the remake, ironically called the remaster, considering it's different from the original, brings back what the beta had, and that's such an epic thing that Capcom would reintroduce, by opening up on the explorability of Resident Evil. There were a lot of scrap characters and ideas that would have changed Resident Evil quite a bit. One of those was Gessler, a cyborg character who had been heavily injured and rebuilt with mechanical parts. He was eventually removed because he felt out of place in the more grounded horror-focused narrative. Gessler was designed to be sort of a guardian to the player, guiding them through the dangers of the mansion. As the team's heavy weapons specialist and a war veteran, he had been converted into a cyborg and was controlled by an AI named Laura. Gessler did some pretty wild stuff, like using his strength to keep a ceiling from collapsing on Jill, which is the scene we know as when Jill tries to retrieve the shotgun and Barry saves her, and even riding atop of Neptune with a T-virus infected shark to keep it from attacking her. Ultimately, Gessler was replaced by Barry Burton when the game moved away from its sci-fi elements. It's honestly mind-boggling to think how much easier this game would have been with a big giant cyborg military soldier following us everywhere. It definitely would take away from the scare and the isolation, since Gessler is larger than life and practically nearly an impenetrable cyborg with superhuman strength. Albert Wesker, the traitorous star member we all know, was originally named Albert Hustler. Ironically, seems quite fitting that his role as the villain was always locked in from the start. Out of all the characters within Resident Evil 1 in the beta, he was probably the most closest to his look in the final release. Usually in the original scenario in the final release, Barry might be still alive at this point if you make it to the lab and you've obviously done all the things that require you to make sure he's alive. He would eventually turn on you before eventually defying Wesker and all his blackmails, and would help Jill in return. Wesker in this version just straight up shoots Gessler, leaving him for dead. And inside the biolab, instead of the other tyrant we know from final release, this mutated creature is called the DIO. It's a lot different in appearance compared to the looks of the tyrant that is more human in appearance compared to the DIO that looks like a reptilian humanoid. Everything plays out just like the original ending if you're playing as Jill and you've gone for the bad ending. Same scenarios happen when the tyrant and the DIO bust loose. It attacks Wesker, leaving him on the floor in a pool of blood.
Don't come this way! No!
The technological elements tied to these characters were considered too far removed from survival horror tone that the developers were aiming for. For example, the original design for Chris Redfield was far more militarized, heavily armed and intended to be the sole playable character. Over time this was toned down, and his name in earlier versions was actually Beamer Mercurio. Jill Valentine, known as then as Jill Morrison, was added as a second protagonist to balance gameplay. with clear differences in her outfit. She originally wore a white shirt with ripped pants, compared to her final design with a blue uniform and no rips. She also functioned as an AI buddy for Chris, depending on which character you chose. Chris would act as one part of the Act 1 of the first part of the game, and Jill would play in Act 2 in the second part of the game, giving the chance for the player to play as both characters throughout the entire playthrough in one sitting. The Resident Evil pre-beta included a scrapped character known as the Lady Hunter, an early concept that was eventually removed from the final game. The Lady Hunter was a mutated woman with hunter DNA spliced into her, making her a hybrid between a human and the deadly hunter creatures from the series. This character was designed to introduce a more grotesque and terrifying threat early on in the game. The Lady Hunter's role took place in the greenhouse of the Spencer Mansion, a location that underwent significant changes before the final release. Instead of the usual puzzle where the player uses chemicals to destroy a plant, Chris would encounter the Lady Hunter and have a face-off against her daughters, smaller hunter-like enemies that look like plants, in a mini-battle using the flamethrower. This would have made the flamethrower available much earlier in the game compared to its underground appearance in the final version. During this section, Jill Valentine would have been incapacitated by gas released in the greenhouse, leaving Chris to handle the confrontation alone. Ultimately, this segment along with the Lady Hunter's character was removed when the game's development shifted away from sci-fi elements and focused more on traditional survival horror. Chris and Jill would have been joined by a tall, skinny African-American character named Dewey, who was planned as an unlockable third playable character, and while Dewey was eventually cut from the final game, his name was repurposed and given to Edward Dewey, the Bravo's team helicopter pilot in the original game. The severed hand found by Alpha Team member Joseph Frost before he was killed by the zombie dogs was originally meant to belong to Edward. When the Resident Evil remake came out, there was notable changes such as replacing Edward Dewey with Kevin Dooley. Edward's full face was revealed in Resident Evil 0, where he dies on the Ecliptic Express and later reanimates as a zombie. In this scene, players must navigate the train to prevent it from crashing. Early in development, Capcom wanted to include more action-orientated gameplay elements inspired by that first-person approach we mentioned earlier on. This included faster enemy encounters and more real-time combat sequences. As development progressed, the team decided to lean back into the slower, more methodical survival horror mechanics that defined the series. The pre-beta stages were also featured different layouts, concept art, and designs that were showcased but eventually scrapped. Modders have since pieced together some of these concepts that weren't included in the final version of Resident Evil. One of the most significant changes in these pre-betas was the introduction of Rebecca Chambers, originally named Yuno, who was supposed to die earlier on in the game. She would have succumbed to the venomous bite from the Yawn, the giant snake boss, a role that later shifted to Richard Aiken when the team reworked the story.
Ouch! You're wounded! What kind of demon attacked you?
It was a huge snake, and also poisonous. Ugh.
Yuno, or rather Rebecca, eventually dies and succumbs to the venomous bite of the Yawn snake, so her character arc would not have extended any further at this point. But Capcom, changing the story, realised that they could put her to much use in terms of her character and her overall use in the series, and what would eventually be her story in the actual final release of Resident Evil in 1996. The pre-beta also served as a precursor to Resident Evil 0, which started development on the Nintendo 64 back in 1998. It eventually made its way to the GameCube and was released as a prequel to the Resident Evil series, later ported to platforms such as Nintendo Wii, PS3, PS4, PC, Xbox 360, Xbox One, and Switch. In Resident Evil 0, the AI buddy system was introduced, allowing the player to arm their partner who would assist in combat. In contrast, the early beta version featured a companion who would follow but not engage in combat. Another big shift was that the original concept for Resident Evil was supposed to be the first person and included AI-controlled allies, but the technical limitations of the PlayStation made this vision impossible. The final game was adjusted to match the available hardware, which led to the more familiar third-person perspective and the lone survival gameplay we see in the original release. So Resident Evil 0 was never officially released for the Nintendo 64. While development for the game initially began on Nintendo 64 back in '98, technical limitations, particularly regarding the system's cartridge capacity, prevented the game from being completed on that platform. The project was later shifted to the Nintendo GameCube, where it was eventually released in 2002. The game took advantage of the GameCube's disc-based system and improved hardware, allowing it to feature better graphics and more detailed environments and the character switching mechanics that would have been difficult to achieve on the N64. There were prototypes and concept builds for the Nintendo 64, but none of these were ever officially released to the public. The gameplay was pretty much the same as Resident Evil in the final release, with the door loading screens and inventory management system, except for the added twist of controlling multiple characters as I've just explained. In the pre-beta of Resident Evil, the exhibition room had some noticeable differences from the final release. In the final game, players could move a table to reveal a zombie lying on the ground and grab some ammo from the area or whatever else. Additionally, players could push the steps near the woman's statue in the centre of the room to retrieve a map of the mansion's floor. A zombie would be found in the art supply section, and an ink ribbon could be collected from a shelf at the back of the room. You could even stomp on the zombie's head too if you didn't shoot them. In contrast, the 0.5 beta featured a more dynamic gameplay sequence. Jill would use her lockpick to unlock the door to the L-shaped corridor, whilst Chris kept the zombies at bay, trying to push through the door from the main hall. This cooperative element was unique to this beta, as it gave it more emphasis on the teamwork between Chris and Jill. In the final release of the access to the L-shaped corridor, players would still need to use the sword key if they was Chris, or the lockpick as Jill on their solo playthroughs, but without the added action sequence where Chris held up the zombies from entering, and it's this early concept that also shows how Capcom was experimenting with more interactive and tense encounters, where the playable characters had to manage threats in real time. But now this is where things get weird. Dewey, a character who was cut from the final game, showed up in a bathroom scene. Imagine him walking in to find this dude fully naked with an abnormally large penis that could slap hunters to death. Well, at least that's what it appears to be, unless he's actually got a third arm down there. It's amusing to think that Chris just walked into the room completely unfazed by all of this, but Jill, being Jill, freaks out and bolts out of the room. But you know what? She comes back for a second glance. Dewey, cool as hell, invites her into the tub for a dip, but it's pretty obvious that it looks like he could have been injecting himself in the PP with the T-virus, and it definitely looks like it's a bad idea, because I mean that thing is just a little over the top. And at some point after the fight, just in time, we see Dewey chasing the lady hunter with his massive dong. I mean, classic. It kind of really feels like what would be actually intended in Shinji Mikami's comedy twist in this horror-based survival game. Also in the pre-beta also featured a character called Murphy, a random dude just chilling in the piano room, claiming he's been playing there for a week, completely oblivious to the zombie apocalypse going on outside. It's hilarious, it's weird, and honestly a bit unsettling at the same time. It definitely breaks the isolated horror vibe, but in a way, it adds an extra layer of oddness that works in its own way. And if some of you remember, within the game in both the Jill and Chris playthrough, Jill could actually play the piano piece to actually unlock a certain part of the door to use the emblem that will give her an item that is key to the quest objective. Or on Chris's playthrough, for example, Rebecca would have to come in and actually play the piano for Chris, essentially doing the same puzzle where we change the emblems over, which unlocks the clock puzzle to get an essential item, like one of the keys to unlock around some of the doors in the mansion. In the Resident Evil pre-beta, the piano room featured a significantly different setup compared to the final release. Instead of solving the Moonlight Sonata puzzle, players would find a broken shotgun in this area. This broken shotgun could then be used to replace the real shotgun found in the suspended ceiling trap room, which functions similarly to the final version's mechanic in the finished game. The broken shotgun is found in a storage room near a safe room, making this location change a notable difference. Interestingly, Jill's playthrough had some unique dynamics tied to the shotgun. In the final release, if Jill grabs the shotgun without replacing it with a false one, Barry Burton will usually come to her rescue, preventing her from being crushed by the descending ceiling trap. However, if you encounter Barry earlier in the game at the forest's location where his body is found, he will not come to your aid in the shotgun room, forcing you to replace the real shotgun with the false one to avoid death. It's this slight variation in how events play out that added that layer of strategy to Jill's playthrough. For Chris, on the other hand, there is no assistance. You must replace the real shotgun with the broken one in order to avoid the ceiling trap, and there is no Barry to come to the rescue. In the Resident Evil beta, a variety of environments and themes were considered before the game settled on its iconic Western-style mansion. Early concepts included settings like contemporary buildings, hospitals, schools, graveyards, and even castles. Despite the differences, the common thread amongst all these ideas was the sense of confinement and the pressing need to escape elements that would define the final game's claustrophobic and tense atmosphere. As for the enemies, the developers originally explored concepts beyond traditional zombies. Ideas range from psychological horrors inspired by Psycho to evil spirits haunting the mansion. However, these were eventually scrapped in favour of a more biological threat, resulting from a freak accident in a research lab leading to the creation of the flesh-craving zombies and mutated monsters we now know in the final game. Zombies were also considered, but not the modern kind. They envisioned ghouls, spiders, and more flexible and different serving minions to a larger menace. Mutated creatures that we're familiar with. Players could choose from 3 characters to form a 2-person team. Initially, only 2 characters were selectable. The 3rd character was a bonus option unlocked later. This team-based system meant players had to work closely with their AI control partner to investigate the mansion, free interconnected buildings, and escape. The primary goal was to escape the mansion by locating and using a hidden helicopter, though this wasn't immediately revealed. The game ended if the main character died, and if a partner died, the game continued, but their death made survival and progression far more difficult. Unique partner abilities were lost upon their death, and fewer items could be carried, often requiring a lot of backtracking. Healing and status management was very interesting in the early concepts. Players could heal by eating food or drinking water. Poison could be treated with medicine like serum or antidotes, but ignoring it would gradually deplete HP over time. Importantly, partners could not be revived once dead, and their bodies and items would remain at the spot where they fell, allowing the other player to pick up their supplies. And for the AI partner system, which was a crucial component of the beta, partners operated independently, making decisions based on their own judgment rather than being directly controlled by the player. This was designed to create a more realistic and dramatic dynamic, emphasizing cooperation and the unpredictability of human behavior. A lot of partners were programmed to support the player but would switch priorities when in danger. For example, if a partner's HP was critically low and they risked dying from the next enemy attack, their behaviour would shift from protecting the player to protecting themselves, often hiding behind the player. And if a partner died early in the game, players could return to the starting point to recruit a new one. However, once the team entered Mansion 2, this option disappeared. The vehicle used to access Mansion 2 would be destroyed, blocking the return path and forcing players to continue alone if their partner had died. Interestingly, time passed in real time within the game, even when accessing the inventory. Pause in the game would freeze the action but wouldn't display the main screen. The mechanic added tension as players couldn't really rely on the inventory screen to strategize without consequences. This isn't something we'd see in the final version of Resident Evil, but in the future Resident Evil games in the series, such as Outbreak and Resident Evil 5 with its co-op elements, and was even seen in the beloved Resident Evil 7, which made strategy very important. By the third stage of development in late 1994, Resident Evil's core characters had taken shape, closely resembling their final counterparts in both narrative and gameplay roles. At this point, the team was still referred to as the Raccoon SWAT Bravo team and had an early version of their logo, a scorpion emblem rather than the stars emblem that we see. Jill had also received her final last name. Rather than Morrison's, it was Valentine, though her character did remain largely unchanged from earlier concepts. The supporting cast, however, saw significant refinements. Gessler became more integral to the plot, originally intended to betray the team under Wesker's orders. The game's introduction featured two casualties, Joseph and a woman named Gwen. Gwen would eventually be cut from the story, leaving no direct successor in later versions. Another character, Richard, was present, but he had an undefined role in the scripts available from this stage of development. But by early 1995, during the fourth stage of development, the character roster had nearly reached its final form. Jill was elevated to the main character status, and the party system, once a key mechanic, was removed. Characters were rearranged into their near-final identities. Uno was reworked into Mathilda, shifting from Beam's co-pilot to his dedicated story partner. Gessler's size and traitorous nature were repurposed into Barry Burton, who would then become Jill's primary ally.
Thank you, Barry.
Well, what do you know?
Oh, don't blame Barry for everything. I hear that his better half and two lovely daughters will be in danger if he doesn't do everything I tell him to.
Ed and Gessler were merged into a redesigned Edward, a supporting character with a large build, though he retained Ed's name in a more superficial sense. There are no known illustrations of this version of Edward, but an early guidebook depiction suggests he was significantly taller and heavier in the final game. Originally, Joseph was intended to find Edward's entire body rather than just his severed hand. Gwen's removal led to Joseph assuming her narrative function, dying in the same manner she would have. Carlisle was reworked into Kenneth, inheriting Ed's ethnicity, whilst Ed's new form took on Carlisle's. Uno's original thematic role, being a character who would die in the mansion unless the player intervened, was transferred to Richard. Meanwhile, Brad was introduced and took over Beam's role as the pilot. A key structural change also emerged at this point when the team was officially divided into two squads, Alpha and Bravo team, marking a major step forward towards the final identity of Resident Evil's iconic STARS unit. If you take a look at this chart, it describes the changes involving each character that was split into different stages at the very early concepts into the final retail version. Essentially, it shows us the evolution of these characters in their names and different roles that they would play.
What is this?
Wow, what a mansion!
Captain Wesker, where's Chris?
Many of Resident Evil's cut features have been extensively documented, but some remain more obscure or are not fully covered in available translations. From the main menu itself, one of the planned features was a customizable ID system. Rather than using preset identification numbers, players would have been able to enter a personal ID via a keypad, which could then be stored alongside their saved data. A recreated version of this feature based on preview builds and design documents provides insight into how it may have functioned. A significant gameplay mechanic that was ultimately cut involved zombies being able to break down doors and enter different rooms. To counter this, players would have the ability to barricade entrances, a bit like Call of Duty Zombies. While this feature was removed from the original game, it was later reintroduced in the 2002 remake, adding an additional layer of tension. Whilst you couldn't barricade doors on any version of Resident Evil, the idea of it is still cool. Even in the director's cut, zombies would break through doors, but only in sequenced areas. Another removed feature was an inventory management improvement. Players would have been able to swap an item in their inventory for another when their inventory was full, rather than having to discard or backtrack to an item box. A similar mechanic was later incorporated in Resident Evil Outbreak. Several weapons were planned but never implemented in the final version. Among them was Wesker's smoke grenades. At one point, Wesker was intended to carry smoke grenades, although their intended function remains unclear. Perhaps maybe in a boss fight he'd use them to remain undetected. And we had the M18A1 Claymore mines. These were supposed to be placed on the ground and would have been found in the armory beneath the dormitory. However, the development team was unable to implement them due to time constraints, but these could have been super useful against pursuing zombies. And for Jill, and while both Chris could use a flamethrower in the armory, Jill would not have been able to use it due to its weight. Instead, Barry would have picked it up and used it on her behalf. But a scene with Barry wielding a flamethrower does still exist in the final game. There was even intended to be defensive weapons that originally were considered for the early concept of the game. These weapons though would be later re-implemented in the remake, allowing players to counter enemy attacks. As well as the grenade launcher variant. The grenade launcher itself had an early design featuring a foregrip, similar to the version seen once again in the remake. Game files are typically among the last elements written in a Resident Evil title and often serves as some lore or background to the game we're playing, and whilst many were finalised, some were ultimately removed. However, remnants of these files can still be found in the Japanese demo version. The lost documents included a written invitation, a thank you letter, and Trevor's notes 1 to 9. These files would have provided additional background lore for the mansion and contained clues for various puzzles. Speaking of puzzles, several of them and items were considered during the development but were later scrapped into different forms, such as Torch's lit flag. A reference to this mechanic is mentioned in the early files, but no further details exist. Or V-Jolt's early name, originally referred to as Kangaroo Jolt, likely a reference to boxing due to its devastating effect. And for the oil painting puzzle, in an early version of the game, a puzzle was planned for the lounge where Kenneth's body is found in the final version. Instead of a corpse, players would have encountered an oil painting by pressing a switch in the hallway. The lounge lights would turn off, revealing Orion's constellation in the painting itself. This puzzle shares similarities with the final gallery puzzle that we know in both the remake and the original. Plus, there was meant to be something called the bread puzzle, a cryptic puzzle that was never fully developed. The word bread would have been scrawled in blood next to Forrest's body. In Chris's scenario, if Jill entered without Barry, it would have simply read red, implying Barry may have tampered with the message. This is similar to the altered researcher's will file in the final game. There was also a pickaxe item that was initially intended for use in the back area of the main hall to break the floor and retrieve an unknown item. Later, its function was reassigned to the recital room, where it would have been used to access George Trevor's grave. The clue for this puzzle would have been the distinct sound the floor made when walked on and examined. Interestingly, in the original game, this room does not include a tombstone in front of the ladder. However, in the director's cut version, a tombstone was added. In the remake, the wall around the tomb was either cracked or had plants grown around it. Plus, you don't find Mr. Trevor's diary atop of the tombstone itself in the earlier versions apart from the remake. Plus, there was something called the dual keys mechanic. Originally, the lockup area would have required two identical keys instead of collectible or discs that we had in the final version. This mechanic later appeared in subsequent Resident Evil games with its similarities, requiring two characters to operate certain systems simultaneously like doors. A lot of these cut features highlight the ambitious scope of Resident Evil's development story and how there was actually intended to be more lore built into the original game, but would rather be implemented into the remake, and some of the elements in that game from the beta would actually later on inspire some of the other games in the series, with many mechanics and ideas later reappearing in future titles within the series overall. Numerous concept artworks of the Spencer Mansion existed, showcasing both finalised and scrapped rooms. Whilst most of the planned areas made it into the final game, several designs were either significantly altered or removed entirely. One of the most notable cut locations was a chapel, which never made it into the final game, but would later appear in Resident Evil 4 and other titles. It's unclear what purpose this room would have served, but it may have played a role in the game's religious or scientific themes. And in earlier designs there was an entrance structure built above the underground laboratory. This was eventually replaced by the fountain in the final game. While little remains of the design, remnants of its purpose can still be seen in how players transition between the mansion and the lab. And a lake and multiple boathouses were planned for the game, covering a significant portion of the map. These areas would have introduced water-based hazards, and concept art suggests an eerie, misty environment with swamp-like terrain. The idea was ultimately cut, but later repurposed for Resident Evil 7, which featured similar swamp shacks and deep water sections.
Jack? What the fuck?
Interestingly, players could sink into deeper swamp areas, potentially leading to instant death. One of the wooden shacks designed for this area was later adapted into Lisa Trevor's cabin in the Resident Evil remake. Much like the final game, the player was originally meant to escape via helicopter, as described in the earlier scripts. However, instead of a simple helipad, there was once a heliport tower with a high-tech communication room filled with equipment. The original heliport was enclosed by a fence, which was also an early entry point into the mansion, suggesting players may have started the game differently. And to access the helicopter, players would have had to use an elevator leading to the tower. Ultimately, this structure was deemed too futuristic and was removed, replaced with a standard helipad for a more grounded and believable setting. However, some of its design elements were still later repurposed in future Resident Evil games. During the development of the original Resident Evil, several enemy concepts were conceived but ultimately omitted or altered in the final release. Many of these designs have been preserved through concept art, providing insight into creative processes behind the game's iconic adversaries, such as the mayfly that intended to inhabit a swamp area that was later removed from the game as we spoke in the latter. The mayfly was designed to appear in 3 distinctive stages: larva, pupa, and adult. These creatures would have attacked from above, emitting characteristics buzzing sound and utilising poison-based assaults, reminiscent of the wasps that appear in the final version. Another proposed enemy was a colossal crab, approximately 2 meters in height and spanning 2 to 3 meters in width. This creature was envisioned to dwell near aquatic environments initially, but it would have resembled a stationary shell, but upon closer approach by the player, its eyes would emerge, followed by a full reveal of its formidable form. And the creature known in the final game as the Chimera was originally referred to as Flyman, a descriptor that aptly captures its grotesque hybrid appearance. And its iterative design process is what led to enemies encountered in the final released game. There was even zombie children. Concepts for juvenile zombies were explored during development, but however the idea was ultimately discarded due to concerns over the depiction of violence against childlike figures, which was deemed inappropriate. There was even something called naked zombies, or puppet zombies. These enemies did not exhibit significant differences in design or behaviour compared to standard zombies, but the reasoning behind this initial designation remains very unclear. Perhaps some of these zombies were not wearing clothes at the time when they were human, and hence why they was naked. Also, Plant 42 in its early designs is depicted as much larger and way more intricate and more of a dangerous adversary. However, due to its technical constraints and obviously programming challenges, its size and complexity were reduced in the final game. There was even an early concept for the game's final boss, a creature named Dio, which bore little resemblance to the eventual Tyrant design, but notably Dio possessed the ability to actually speak, adding a layer of menace to its character, where the Tyrant just remained silent and menacing. Tyrant itself had plenty of prototypes, because in the laboratory areas, developers initially planned to include prototype Tyrants housed within these test tubes, providing players with a foreboding glimpse of Umbrella's experiments. But once again, that is something that we would see later in the Resident Evil series.
These are tyrants.
And in terms of different designs, there was other enemy concepts which were considered but really not implemented, including an alternative spider design, which was far more terrifying compared to the giant spiders in the final game that resembled the spiders we know and see. Plus there was even like a face-hugger type creature, inspired by the movie Alien franchise, and this monster would have latched onto characters' faces. There would have been giant centipedes, crickets, and leeches. These creatures were envisioned to add diversity to the game's beastry in the original game, but however we'd see these different monsters live on throughout the rest of the series, especially within Resident Evil 0. There was even hybrid creatures such as an amalgamation of a snake and rat, a mutated frog attacking with its tail, and a robust rodent with like a stone armor shell, and a massive worm capable of consuming characters whole. And while these concepts did not make it into the original Resident Evil, many were revisited and reimagined in subsequent titles, all playing its part to contribute to the franchise's enduring legacy of just innovative and terrifying adversaries that we see later in the series. It's really all thanks to these Resident Evil 1 concepts. During the development of Resident Evil, several story elements and character interactions were altered or removed entirely. Many of these changes would have added new depth to the game's narrative and expanded on the characters' roles, or introduced new gameplay moments. In earlier versions of the game, interactions with the Bravo team were more significant. Aside from Rebecca, at least one other Bravo member was intended to survive. Their dialogue would have played a greater role in the exposition, and one of them was likely Forrest, who was initially planned to reappear as a zombie. This idea was later reinstated in Resident Evil Director's Cut, and other subsequent versions. Enrico was also meant to survive longer than he does in the final game. Additionally, in the introduction sequence, Joseph was originally scripted to discover Edward's full body rather than just his severed hand. An earlier version of the introduction featured Gwen, a scrapped character, being attacked instead of Joseph. In this version, the team's helicopter would have been surrounded by Cerberus hounds, forcing them into a desperate last stand. As the undead dogs continued to rise despite being shot down, the team would ultimately decide to flee. And in terms of gameplay and in environmental changes, the trap ceiling room was actually triggered after acquiring the shotgun, as some of you may know, was initially planned to feature deadly spikes, making it an even greater threat. Plus, a cutscene was originally scripted in the bar area, where examining the shelf for the musical score would have triggered a zombie attack. And the wooden emblem, a key puzzle item, was at one point located in the exhibition room, where the first floor mansion map is found in the final game. Rebecca was originally meant to be attacked by hunters in a doll room, a location that would be later replaced by the small library, a concept that would definitely find its way and later be reworked into Resident Evil Village in the house Beneviento in that very sequence.
Don't leave. I can't let you.
You're still alive, huh? You better find me cool before my friends murder you.
And the grave mechanism after the second yawn fight was initially designed differently. Instead of being activated by a mechanism, the player would have had to physically have moved it. Furthermore, the grave originally belonged to an unnamed researcher, as the Trevor backstory was only added later within the development. And one of the emblems required to open the lab entrance was initially placed in the kitchen rather than the mansion's main hall. And for the lab sequence and character dynamics, the Keeper's Diary, one of the game's most memorable files, was originally intended to fall out of a closet before the zombie burst out. And there was a scene that was going to play when Jill Valentine entered the armory under the dormitory. Barry would have arrived on the scene, as well as taking the flamethrower he uses against Plant 42 that we see him use in the remade version, leaving Jill with the Claymore mines to be picked up. Also, Chris and Rebecca were originally meant to watch the slideshow in the projection room together, and recorded dialogue for these scenes still exist within the game's files. Jill and Barry also had similar cutscenes as well. Why don't we take a listen to some of the dialogue that was removed but found in the game's files?
Chris!
Rebecca! You're safe!
I saw you in the garden. I've caught up with you at last. But it's a strange place, isn't it? Is this a meeting room or something?
Seems like it.
What is it? A slide projector?
Yes, I'll show you.
Does it work?
Yeah, let's take a look.
I feel like we're having a secret meeting.
Let's go. I think I'm beginning to understand.
Now where are we?
Looks like a meeting room.
Does it work?
I'm going to try it.
Oh, what is this?
Let's get going. You're quiet. What are you worrying about?
Nothing. Don't worry.
Rebecca was supposed to accompany Chris more frequently into the laboratory, including a segment where she would crawl through vents to retrieve a key to the engine room, as Chris was too large to fit through them. If Rebecca died earlier in the game, this area would have remained inaccessible. Following this sequence, Rebecca would return to investigate the vents, further leading to a scripted event where she falls from a ceiling into the engine room, triggering a conversation with Chris. Lines for this scenes were recorded but never used.
Ouch!
Rebecca! What are you doing in this place?
Oh, Chris! I was almost attacked by a monster, but I escaped through the other draft hole. Then I came... Ouch!
Well, I'm glad you're all right. Don't go out alone.
Yes, sir. By the way, where are we?
It looks like a power room, but I'm not sure. How about you? Did you find something?
Chris, look at this.
What's the matter?
It's a triggering system for a bomb.
What?
Great! Wow, I've never seen such a big bomb. How come?
It's dangerous. Don't touch it.
With cut dialogue and ending variations in a near-final script, a confrontation between Chris and Wesker featured a alternative exchange. Wesker would say, "How about this, Chris? Wouldn't you want an invincible body through the Tyrant virus?" To which Chris would reply, "No way," and then Wesker would say, "Then die." The flare was used to signal extraction was initially found on Wesker's body in the Concepts 2, rather than in a separate location. The self-destruct timer was originally set for 10 minutes, with an announcement warning that all personnel should evacuate at least 1 kilometre away from the mansion. In another version, the distance was increased to 10 kilometres. The Tyrant battle was also more demanding. Players needed to fire all 4 rockets to defeat it. The first 2 would miss or be dodged, the third would stagger the Tyrant, and only the fourth one would deliver the final blow. The game's intro and ending cinematics were initially intended to be fully CGI rather than live action sequences seen in the final release. One of the scrapped endings involved the mansion not exploding. In this version, as the survivors escaped, a final shot would reveal the Tyrant's silhouette standing in front of the mansion, implying its survival. Another cut ending featured a sequence where if the self-destruct timer ran out, the player's character would be shown engulfed in flames, perishing in an explosion. One of the early working titles for the game was Razan. Helix, the now iconic term survival horror, was actually coined by Capcom. Initially, the villains in the story were envisioned as a cult. This later evolved into the actual US military, before being changed once more to a massive multinational corporation. This final iteration led to the creation of Umbrella, shaping the game's continuity as we know it. BOWs, bioorganic weapons, were originally called BHWs, biohazard weapons. Umbrella's grand plan was to use zombies controlled by tyrants on a large scale to seize power. A significant reason why the game's Japanese dub was scrapped was the development team wanted it to resemble a Western movie brought over on VHS with Japanese subtitles. Additionally, they felt Japanese voice acting wouldn't fit the game's atmosphere. The intro featuring a Japanese dub was recorded, and footage of it still exists.
作戦途中で消息を絶った同僚のブラボーチームのヘリを探してラクーン北西の森林地帯を飛んでいた。まだ見つからんか？見つかりませんね。最近ラクーンで頻発している奇妙な連続猟奇殺人事件がある。10人前後のグループで民家を襲い人間を食い殺すという狂った事件だ。
The final game is set in 1998. At the time of the development, this was the near future, but still grounded in realism. Setting it in the 2000s and beyond would have implied a more futuristic setting, which the team wanted to avoid. The viral outbreak in the mansion and the lab, according to early drafts, was a result of an accident during a surgery on the Tyrant. The virus leaked, and by that point, there was no way to stop it. Some researchers understood what was happening and attempted to treat themselves with antiviral drugs, but it was futile. The rest of the staff, only partially informed by the nature of the research, fell into panic, while strange disappearances in Raccoon City did make it into newspapers outside the town. The news never gained serious coverage beyond local reports. But it's interesting to see how all this would carry over into Resident Evil 3, with Raccoon City being closed off because of all the zombies. Many of the missing people were killed and mutilated by stray zombies and the dogs. There was even road closed signs and increased police patrols who were blocking off roads leading into the Arklay Mountains to contain the threat. And according to the concepts, the STARS members were designed with a distinct silhouette and colour schemes so they could be easily identified at a glance. Their official seating positions in the helicopters can be found in early development materials. Prior to the mansion incident, STARS took part in several rescue operations. Jill was initially designed with a bob cut, but after seeing the live-action actress's long hair, the team adjusted the design so she wears her hair in a bun under her beret. Chris's design was inspired by Keanu Reeves in Speed, and Rebecca's design wasn't based on anyone specific, but her choker was inspired by Matilda from the movie Leon the Professional. In early drafts, she was even named Mathilda. Interestingly, the gun Leon wields in Resident Evil 4 and what we see him carry throughout the majority in the series is named Matilda. Aside from Rebecca's choker, which is rarely visible given on her low-resolution model, she also is known to wear a seashell earring, a detail that is seen within the concept art. Barry was designed to be a more mature-looking character among the youthful STARS team. Meanwhile, Wesker's design was centered around an all-black villainous aesthetic, a look that would define his future appearance in the series. Though not explicitly stated in the game, Wesker is confirmed to be a doctor and researcher, making his full title Dr. Albert Wesker. In Resident Evil 1, this is kind of indicated in the slideshow in the game. He also served as a security officer tasked with protecting the lab from external interference, while overseeing internal staff. The combat data he collected on STARS came from cameras hidden throughout the mansion. Wesker also had a counter-virus in his body, making him immune to the T-virus and most attacks. Concept notes confirm that Barry was under Wesker's orders the entire time.
Barry.
You gotta love Barry. He must really be afraid of Umbrella.
You and Umbrella took his family, you bastard. Oh!
And one of the key reasons for Bravo Team's helicopter's crash was mutated crows flying into it. Brad Vickers fled the scene after hearing gunshots and seeing the Cerebuses. Notably, the Cerebuses themselves were meant to be all clones. The iconic white-headed zombie from the infamous turnaround scene wasn't actually designed by Capcom. A subcontracted company responsible for the CG scenes made the zombies without instruction. Yet it was retroactively incorporated into the game because redoing the scene would have taken far too long. Whilst the turning around zombie was conceived by Capcom, a little help by other sources made the iconic zombie come to life, not just within Resident Evil the game, but within its promotional art for the likes of the director's cut. But it is widely referenced in Umbrella Chronicles and in the 2021 Welcome to Raccoon City. And the gunshot heard in the main hall is actually meant to be from Kenneth.
What is that?
I'll go and check.
Okay, Jill and I will stay in the hall in case of an emergency.
Most of the dormitory rooms in the game are mirrored or reused assets from different angles. In one version of the script, the aquarium was destroyed in an explosion caused by a researcher, and the hunters appearing in the mansion upon the player's return were meant to be released by Wesker from the laboratory. And the Tyrant was originally described as a prisoner, a violent and highly proud man. In the early drafts, the Tyrant itself was the source of the virus and could control zombies, hence the name Tyrant Virus. The embryo of the Tyrant had already been cloned before the events of the game. Wesker had orders to destroy the T-Virus 002 to erase all evidence. And the Tyrant attacking Wesker wasn't random at all. It was the fact that it was described he was enraged at his creator. Audio was recorded for a long scream when Wesker was impaled by the Tyrant, but it was cut from the final version. The mansion self-destruct system was inspired, of course, by films like Aliens. The game's writers clearly had fun while working on the scenario, as seen in a wittingly written lines such as the scrapbook that you'll actually find in the library, and I quote, "But who could have compiled all this? It was Wesker. I wonder if Captain Wesker knows about this. Naturally." In the dormitory, I quote, "I spotted you two in the hall and followed you here. Honest," said Wesker, lying calmly. And if Barry dies, I quote, "Barry," Jill screams echoes in an empty room. Alright then. Her mood changes in 2 seconds as she heads for the helipad, showing that the writers at Capcom really had a bit of a comedic taste, but obviously took it out of the game because it just didn't feel too right in a serious kind of setting. With this, we conclude the trivia section. However, there's one last interesting detail. Around mid-1995, the game scenario was nearly complete and was almost identical to the final release, except for one major difference. An epilogue. This was ultimately removed. Now in the epilogue, Chris is quoted saying, along with Rebecca Chambers, then known as Mathilda, but we'll start with Chris, "Now I live a carefree everyday life in a little town. Even though my days used to be swayed by work upon work, I still get nostalgic about them. Yes, there were cruel days, days coupled with death. Huh? Do I regret it? Not at all. I think, right, I promised her to go fishing. She's such a weird girl, she loves fishing." And then, that's when Rebecca chimes in, "I'm coming, it's time we left, huh?" And then Chris puts, "If I keep her waiting, she'll be mad at me all day. Alright, hey Mathilda, are you ready?" To which weirdly Rebecca replies in a weird way that sounds awfully like they planned a father and daughter dynamic. She says, "Yup, say, Daddy, what are those stars I always see on your sleeve?" Into which Chris replies, "These? Well, these are," and then the quotation ends, which alludes to the idea that Capcom had something completely different tied in with the dialogue there. And the context of it is really hard to try and make out whether it's flirtatious or if they had something else planned altogether. But then again, it's Resident Evil, and there was a lot of mix-ups in the translations back in them days. And well, with that, we close this deep dive into the early concepts of one of the greatest survival horror games of all time. While a few more unearthed concept art exists, there isn't really much else left to uncover. However, the history of Resident Evil doesn't end here, because there's still some interesting things to talk about in regards to the making of this brilliant game. So now we're going to talk about some of the different ports and platforms Resident Evil had to offer, starting with the original game and some of the prototypes, and even the GameCube remaster and the updated HD version on the more advanced consoles. The original Resident Evil on PS1 had several differences between its Western and Japanese versions, with artificial difficulty added in the West. One of the biggest changes was the removal of auto-aim, making it harder to accurately shoot zombies using the tank controls. The Japanese version included auto-aim, giving players an easier time lining up shots. Another key difference was the ink ribbons. Western players only received 2 per pickup, whereas the Japanese version provided 3. Now let's talk about what was changed or removed from the original game. In the Japanese version's character selection screen, Chris is labelled as hard and Jill as easy, making the difficulty difference clear from the very start. Western players, however, had to figure this out through gameplay. The FMV intro sequences were also drastically different. The Western version was heavily censored, toning down the brutality seen in the Japanese release. The Japanese version included extended footage of Joseph being ripped apart by the dogs. Another odd change is how Chris is introduced in the Western version. In his scene is strangely edited compared to others, while in the Japanese version his introduction remains consistent with the rest of the cast. Notably, Chris is seen smoking in both the intro and the bad ending, something that Western censorship wouldn't allow, but he just looks disappointed at the end. Additionally, the Japanese version sticks with English voice acting but includes Japanese subtitles. The soundtrack also differs slightly between regions. The Japanese intro features a bizarre voice clip, "I've got a shotgun," followed by a woman screaming, which feels completely out of place. Why Capcom didn't go with a zombie sound instead is just a mystery. The FMV cutscenes are very corny, but they do hold their own little quirks.
Albert Wesker.
The Japanese ending theme is also unique, featuring actual vocals unlike Western versions, especially in the ending cutscene. And for the uncensored content, the Japanese version shows Kenneth's head roll off by the turnaround zombie compared to the Western version that just shows a bit of blood splatter. A final piece of censorship, Japan didn't have to worry about what was the ending after you beat the game when you unlock the rocket launcher. You was treated to a few different animations of enemies and characters being mutilated in the ending credits. Lastly, one more exclusive feature in the Japanese version is the document images. When picking up text files, players could see the accompanying images that gave context to the notes. Other releases just display a black background and that's it. Resident Evil Japan's demo, the first thing you'll notice in this demo is the character selection screen. While you can highlight both Chris and Jill, you're only able to play as Chris. Most of the scenes remain uncensored, staying true to the original version. The game still features English voice acting with Japanese subtitles.
Is flying around the forest zone situated in northwest Raccoon City.
A unique feature of this demo is the timer. As soon as the character models appear, a 15-minute countdown begins. The timer does not pause during dialogue scenes, but does stop for FMV scenes. Door transitions and inventory management. This means that any time spent in menus or storage boxes is critical. If you're fast enough, you might reach the crest for the guardhouse, but unlike the final Western version, which has 4, this demo only contains 2. Technically, it's possible to make it to the guardhouse, but by then, you'll most likely receive a message indicating that the demo is over. One of the most interesting changes in this demo is the wooden emblem location. In the final game, it's placed above the fireplace, but here, the lady statue is holding the first floor map actually holds the wooden emblem instead. In the same room, you can actually even find an ink ribbon, but it's completely useless since saving is disabled. and the Japanese subtitles even notify the player of this. Another small difference is how Chris climbs the stairs instead of instantly transitioning to the cutscene. He does a short walking animation before it cuts to him moving up the stairs. And when placing the golden emblem over the fireplace, the clock only chimes once, and in the final version, it strikes 3 times. Several gameplay differences are also present. The Yorn boss fight in this demo is completely silent with no background music playing, unlike the final release. In the armor room puzzle, with blocking the poison gas, there's an extra third statue acting as an additional obstacle. And in the bathroom, instead of finding a key when draining the tub, you'll find and receive ammo instead. Now, for some of the bigger changes in the safe room containing the herbicide, you can hear zombie footsteps above. By the time you leave the room, a zombie will appear, adding an extra layer of tension that didn't make it into the final game. And nothing else would be seen like this until the advanced mode of the director's cut, adding an extra layer of tension that didn't make it into the final game. Finally, one eerie detail that was completely removed from the retail release is blood writing on the wall. Interacting with it reveals a chilling message. Breathing is painful. Someone stop this suffering. This closely resembles the infamous Keeper's Diary, where the transformation into a flesh-eating zombie is documented, ending with a haunting itchy, tasty. There were a few prototypes before the official release of Resident Evil, and one of the most notable is the August 4th, 1995 build. This version contains some interesting differences from the final game. Right away, the title screen looks different, and the character selection screen features 2 cards, but both contain Chris as only the playable character. Instead of using a photograph, the section screen shows a hand-drawn illustration similar to the early concept art of Chris. When selecting Start, there is no accompanying audio. Throughout most of the prototype, the only background track that plays is the painting puzzle theme from the final game, which is used to obtain the Wind Crest. There is no voice acting, only death sounds, and the voices that do exist are Japanese, and they don't match the final version. The game starts in the main hall without a cutscene, and access to the mansion is limited. The upstairs area is completely off limits, there is no inventory screen, and the running mechanic has changed. Instead of holding a button, you now double tap forward to sprint. A unique feature in this build is the ability to switch weapons instantly by pressing the button. The weapon in Chris's hand will visibly change on screen, and ammo and health are infinite. The knife has no ready position, instead when attacking, Chris stabs immediately without needing to hold a stance. Several camera angles are different compared to the final game, and certain environmental details are missing. For example, the clock in the main hall does not tick like it does in the retail version. One major gameplay difference is enemy respawns. If you kill an enemy and leave the room and re-enter, the enemy will be back. There are also enemy placement differences. In Kenneth's hallway, his body is missing. Instead of a zombie, there's a hunter, which looks slightly different and has a higher pitched attack noise. The statue room is unfinished and lacks the movable stairs. A corpse is also present in a back room which doesn't exist in the final game. In the dog hallway where the hounds jump through, there are actually spiders instead that attack. Some locked doors from the final game are already unlocked and most objects can't be interacted with. For example, the piano room, the shelf is not interactive. However, Chris can still pick up the shotgun near the trap room. Even though there's no inventory screen, he can still be able to collect it. One major difference in this build is how Chris escapes the shotgun trap. Instead of Jill being rescued by Barry, Barry saves Chris instead. Unlike Jill, who must check both doors to trigger the event, Chris only needs to attempt to leave the room once. Additionally, the player must manually exit the room, unlike in the final version where the game automatically transitions to the next scene. The crest holder in the main hall doesn't exist neither in this version, yet players can still enter the guardhouse without needing the 4 crests. Another major difference is the yawn boss fight. It appears in the wrong location where you'd normally find the square crank. And the actual battle music itself is way different as well. Because there's nowhere to die normally in this prototype, the trap room is the only way to trigger a game over. Instead of displaying "you died," the game simply shows "game over," showing the differences between the prototype and the actual final retail version. The second prototype, dated October 4th, 1995, features several notable changes from the earlier builds. For starters, Jill is now selectable alongside Chris, and both of their portraits are now hand-drawn on the character selection cards. In-game cutscenes now play normally, but there is still no voice acting. Instead, characters communicate through gestures and subtitles. The music selection is also more finalized compared to the previous build. A major addition in this prototype is the introduction of a fully functional inventory screen, although it differs from the final release. The character profile picture in the inventory are completely different from what would appear in the finished game. Now that the inventory system exists, weapon selection has changed. Players must now manually equip weapons instead of cycling through them with a button. Weapons now require ammo, removing the infinite ammunition from the previous build. The knife also requires a ready stance before attacking, but the ready position is different from the final version, taking longer to set up. There are several enemy placements that have been adjusted. A zombie is now present in Kenneth's hallway, but Kenneth's body is still missing and no FMV scene plays. A Magnum is available early in the downstairs area, and the dressing room, which is normally a New Game Plus area, is unlocked, though nothing inside is usable. The early statue room has also been altered slightly, but still appears unfinished and lacks the movable stairs needed to grab the map. The corpse in the back hallway has been removed. Many enemy placements now match their final game locations, but the dog hallway still remains a spider-infested hallway in this build. The shotgun trap is now fully functional. Removing the shotgun from its stand will now trigger the trap, and the shotgun is properly placed in the inventory. The escape sequence plays out as intended, but without voice acting. The upstairs area is now accessible, including the upper dining room and the outside area with Forrester's body. When climbing stairs, players no longer need to press a button. Instead, the character automatically takes a few in-game steps before transitioning into the stair climbing animation. A major final change is dying now leads to the familiar "You died" screen, marking its first appearance in the prototype build. A hunter now makes an appearance. Like the previous prototype, the game ends in the room where the square crank is found as yawn attacks, leading to "Be continued" message. The final prototype, referring to January 31st, 1996, is almost identical to the final release, featuring full cutscenes, voice acting, and only a few noticeable differences.
Barry, where's Barry?
One of the most obvious changes is that debugging code appears on every door transition. The statue puzzle still contains the wooden emblem instead of the first floor map. Storage chests have different sound effects when opened, and the statue with the blue jewel is positioned on the opposite side of the opening on the balcony, meaning the player must run past it and push it backwards instead of the usual approach. The dogkeeper's closet does not contain shotgun shells as in the final game, but instead holds a map of the first floor. However, picking it up crashes the game. The map also has a scribbled code of gibberish on it. A convenient change in this prototype is that the keys are automatically discarded when used on doors without prompting the player. In the final release, the player is asked whenever they want to discard the key manually. Like in the demo version, only 3 crests are required to open the door, leading to the square crank rather than 4. The wing crest is completely missing. The outdoor elevator transitions do not show the elevator descending, instead it simply displays a still image of the controls. In the guardhouse, the red book room and the bathroom are completely empty, lacking zombies. Picking up maps does not automatically open the map screen as in the final game. Bullets do not automatically stack in the inventory screen, meaning players must manually rearrange their inventory to manage ammo. The billiard room features a different background track than the final release. Naked zombies appear in the mansion basement, whereas in the final game, they are exclusive to the laboratory. The elevator battery is found in a secret room behind a bookcase instead of the small room with ammo in the final version. A removed alternative magnet ammo type known as dum-dum rounds was still present in this prototype. These rounds were designed to deal less damage to BOWs but higher damage to zombies and certain bosses. This feature was removed in the final game. Enrico carries the hex crank in this version instead of it being placed near the entrance of his room. And the first boulder in the caves automatically triggers when the player enters, rather than only rolling after investigating it and walking away, making it harder to dodge than in the final release. The flamethrower was originally intended to have spare ammo, allowing it to be reloaded, but this feature was removed from the final game. The Doom book in the caves requires the hex crank to access instead of the square crank, making it inconvenient as players must bring a crank they otherwise wouldn't need at that stage of the game. In the end game lab, naked zombies are shown eating a corpse, whereas in the final game they simply just stand around. A naked zombie also emerges through a hole in the wall, which is not present in the final version. There's even a debug menu that is accessible in this build, allowing players to listen to dialogue, teleport to specific rooms, adjust lighting, and really that's all there is for this final prototype build before the official release.
Chris Redfield. Jill Valentine. Mary Burton. Rebecca Chambers. Albert Biohazard.
Resident Evil's Director's Cut introduces a variety of changes compared to the original release, including new difficulty settings, altered camera angles, retextured environments, and a completely revamped advanced mode. For the first time in the series, players can choose a difficulty mode before starting a new game. As standard mode, this is the original Japanese version of Resident Evil, meaning it includes auto-aim and provides more ink ribbons than the Western release. Then a training mode, where enemies deal less damage and the player is given far more ammo and ink ribbons for an easier experience, and an advanced mode, practically an entirely new experience featuring changed camera angles, retextured rooms, different items and enemy placements, some enemies move faster, a new white Beretta with a random chance to decapitate zombies similar to the shotgun, and each character also starts with a brand new exclusive costume in advanced mode, and the closet key is already unlocked from the start. Jill Valentine wears a sleeveless police uniform instead of her casual outfit. Chris Redfield loses his brown Made in Heaven jacket and instead wears a white undershirt, and Rebecca Chambers swaps her medic uniform for a red shirt, shorts and white outerwear. Certain scripted moments now feature zombies opening doors, making safe rooms less predictable. And now Forrest, previously just a corpse, is now a reanimated zombie that attacks the player. Beating advanced mode while saving all teammates to achieve the best ending rewards the player with unlimited ammo called Python. If advanced mode is too difficult, there is a hidden way to make it easier. On the difficulty selection screen, highlight advanced mode and hold right on the D-pad until the text turns green. This activates a secret assist mode, doubling ammo pickups throughout the entire game. The Japanese version of the Director's Cut now uses the same FMV intros as the Western releases. However, despite what the back of the CD case claims, not all regions received the fully uncensored versions of the live-action intro. Only some European releases, notably French and German versions, featured uncut footage. Meanwhile, the US and Japanese versions retained the censored FMVs from the original Western release. This mix-up led to false advertising about the game's content. Even if you already own the original Resident Evil Director's Cut, it's worth picking up for the added difficulty mods and fresh gameplay experience. And if you own a PC, you can actually get the Director's Cut with the FMV cutscenes all included without the uncensored cuts. As far as I'm aware, this isn't something that Capcom has rectified, but some modders on the PC have fixed this problem. Released in 1998, the Resident Evil Director's Cut DualShock version was a re-release of the 1997 Director's Cut, now featuring full DualShock controller support. However, while analog movement and vibration feedback were welcome additions, this version is infamous for one of the most controversial changes in Resident Evil history, the completely reworked soundtrack. But before we get there, let's talk about some of the DualShock features and gameplay changes. With full analog support, players could now move using the analog stick instead of just using the D-pad. Plus, with the vibration feedback, the controller rumbled when taking damage or firing weapons, just adding more of a layer of immersion to the player experience. There was no visual or gameplay enhancements. The game retained the same character models, backgrounds and textures from the original in '96. No new cutscenes or mechanics were added outside the DualShock support. It was identical to the standard director's cut in terms of gameplay. One of the most widely criticised aspects of the DualShock version was its entirely new soundtrack. Mamoru Samuragochi, credited by Takashi Nagiga, actual composer, the original Resident Evil score was completely replaced with bizarre low-quality compositions that felt way out of place for a horror game. The basement theme became a legendary internet meme, featuring random out-of-tune horn sounds that sounded more like a circus performance than a survival horror track.
You can't play music with a piece of paper!
Hooray! Hooray! That was great, Squidward. All those wrong notes you play made it sound more original.
What? I didn't play any wrong notes.
Yeah, see, you're playing it like this. When ordinarily it goes like this. I'm partially doing it in the key of A minor myself.
Many fans consider the new soundtrack one of the worst aspects of the DualShock version, often modding the game on PC to restore the original music. But why was the soundtrack replaced? At the time, Mamoru Samuragochi was being promoted as a deaf genius composer, which gave the project a sense of prestige. Years later, it was revealed that Samuragochi was a fraud and his works were actually ghostwritten by Takashi Naigaki. The exact reason for the soundtrack replacement remains unclear, but it is suspected that either contractual issues or Capcom wanting a fresh take led to the change. The cool thing is though, the Japanese DualShock version included the fully uncensored live-action intro featuring Chris smoking and gorier shots of Joseph's death. The US version remained censored just like the previous releases. Some copies of Resident Evil's Director's Cut, both standard and DualShock versions, included a Resident Evil 2 demo disc, a huge selling point for fans eagerly awaiting RE2's release in 1998. So now we come to the Sega Saturn version. One thing to notice about this version is that it's a clear port of the American release. Ink ribbon pickups are 2 rather than 3, and it lacks auto-aim. Another thing that stands out in the Saturn's technical aspects, door loading screens take a bit longer than other releases. FMV cutscenes take a while to load, and it takes a little time to return to gameplay after a cutscene ends, because the Saturn uses internal memory rather than a memory card. Saving is noticeably faster than in any other releases. When overwriting a file, the option says update rather than overwrite. Despite what I said about the memory cards earlier, you do have the option of choosing to save the system itself on a cartridge. As for the presentation, doors and objects have changed. During loading screens, doors are presented at 320 by 240 resolution, whereas the PS1 uses 640 by 480 resolution. Some objects, like the dining room clock, look worse than before. Character and enemy models seem to have better textures but appear blockier than on the PS1. One downside is transparency. The Saturn doesn't seem to handle the effect very well. Gun smoke looks grainy and water effects look poor. From the fountain to the dangerous plant growing out of it, to the area you need to drain with a square crank, and the panic music that plays when the dog bursts through the window sounds way different compared to other releases. And even the crow sounds are actually different too. Speaking of the gallery room, one of the puzzle artworks has different dialogue compared to the PS1 version. The PS1 text reads, "The end of life," but the Saturn version reads, "Give me the peace of death and I'll give you the joy of life." The overall change is simple, but just cosmetic. There is even a new enemy variant in this version found in the caves. Instead of hunters, the tick enemy replaces them. Hunters are still in the mansion, but in the caves, ticks take their place. They function and behave like hunters, but look and sound different. And probably the most interesting addition is when Wesker gives his famous speech about his love for the Tyrant after Chris defeats it. Another one pops out of the tube, but only as when you play as Chris. It's a great addition, completely defying what people expected from the PS1 version. After beating the game, you can unlock alternative costumes exclusive to the Saturn version. Jill gets a green beret, shoulder gear and pants, while Chris gets a blue outfit with body armor. Interestingly, you can unlock these costumes before even playing the game with a button code. In the opening cutscene where it says 1998, hold L and R on controller 2 and press start on controller 1. Chris and Jill will already be wearing their new outfits. The biggest feature the Saturn version offers is Battle Mode, unlocked after beating the game, but you can also unlock it early with another button code. Hold X, Y and Z on controller 2 and press start on controller 1. Battle Mode plays similarly to Code Veronica's Time Attack. Players clear a linear series of rooms filled with enemies before reaching the final boss. Ammo is limited, but can be picked up at checkpoints. Different playable characters each have their own loadout, and performance is graded. Even the music is different in Battle Mode. It's actually way more upbeat. There is also 2 new more enemies exclusive to Battle Mode. You fight hunters in the caves, whereas they were replaced in the story mode, but you also see something unexpected. Zombie Wesker. He has way more health than standard zombies, but can still be taken down with a shotgun headshot. Battle Mode runs you through all the main bosses, Yawn, Plant 42 and the Black Tiger, leading up to the final boss, the Golden Tyrant. His health is insane, sponging bullets like a tank, and when you finally beat him, you complete the mode. But sadly there's no unlockable reward for this mode, but it's a fun challenge to complete for high scores. Oh, and if you run out of ammo, the game will automatically kill you. Brutal, I know, but this is Battle Mode. And to be honest with you, it's actually doing you a favour, because if you run out of ammo, there's actually nothing you can do anyway. But this Battle Mode was the foundation for what would eventually become the Mercenaries mode we all know and love.
For all you at home, you've got to check this replay out. Oh my gosh, what a superplex by Leon Kennedy!
The first thing you'll see when launching the PC version is Rendition Ready logo, a company from the 90s known for making computer graphic chipsets, and man does it show. The PC version has the best visuals out of all the releases. Character models don't look as blocky as they do on the PS1, and the game's visuals stand out and far more than ever than before. After launching the game, you can access an options menu to set your controls. Unlike most option menus, which are just text-based, this one shows your character performing the action in real time. Another major change is the FMV cutscenes are now fully uncensored. The American release finally gets the uncensored intro full colour, something even the Japanese version lacked. Other censored parts of the game remain intact. Chris still smokes, Kenneth's head still rolls off, and the violent rocket launcher credit scene is present after unlocking the weapon. Speaking of the rocket launcher, the PC version does things a little differently. Normally to unlock the launcher you need to beat the game in under 3 hours. However, on PC it appears you can take as long as you want. Even if you beat the game in over 3 hours, with no saves, you still unlock it. There are also gameplay quality of life changes. You can skip the annoying door loading screens. One small difference when playing Moonlight Sonata to unlock the secret room, Jill stops playing at a slightly different moment than in other versions. In previous versions the music cut off at a slightly awkward spot. The PC version has a more natural stopping point. Another change is found in the art gallery puzzle. As mentioned earlier, the Saturn version had different text from the PS1 version. Well, the PC version simply removes the title completely and instead gives a description of the image. As for unlockables like other special versions of Resident Evil, the PC version has exclusive costumes. Jill's new outfit resembles her normal extra costume, but features a red top instead of a black and denim cutoffs instead of pants. Chris's new costume is similar to his old extra outfit, but instead of a brown Made in Heaven jacket, he wears a blue bomber jacket and a tie. However, there's a small issue. If you select these new costumes, you can't switch back to your old ones. The clothing rack will simply say old clothes, without giving you the option to change back. When you beat the game, you unlock a special weapon for the character you completed it with, which starts in their inventory on the next playthrough. Unlike other versions, this happens regardless of completion time or number of saves. Interestingly, the Colt Python from the director's cut isn't the reward in this version. Instead, Jill gets an Uzi with infinite ammo. And Chris gets a light machine gun, also with infinite ammo. Resident Evil, known as Deadly Silence on the Nintendo DS, is a fascinating adaptation of the original game. Similar to Resident Evil Director's Cut on the PlayStation, Deadly Silence effectively offers two versions of the game in one package: Classic Mode, a direct port of the original release, and Rebirth Mode, which introduces numerous changes before selecting a mode. Players can even choose the blood colour between red and green. The game opens with a different menu voice compared to the original.
Resident Evil DS.
And now it includes full subtitles. Jill and Chris are once again labelled with different difficulty levels. Chris remains the hard mode option, whilst Jill is now normal mode. Graphically, this is arguably the weakest version of Resident Evil, but given the limitations of the DS's hardware, it's an impressive effort. However, it's a shame that it was never ported to the PSP, where graphical fidelity would have been significantly better. The game was designed for the DS's small screens, which results in noticeably lower quality visuals, especially in the FMV cutscenes. However, a notable improvement is that when picking up the notes, the background remains visible, similar to the original Japanese PlayStation release, rather than displaying a black background. In terms of censorship, the opening cinematic is in black and white, but Kenneth's decapitated head remains intact. From the title screen, the game utilises both DS screens effectively. The bottom screen is used for weapon and inventory management, whilst the top screen displays a live detailed map. Cleared rooms and marked areas are in green, while uncleared rooms appear in red. The top screen also displays health status, which changes colour as the character takes damage. Yellow for caution, orange, red for danger, and purple for poison. Additionally, it shows the equipped weapon and available ammunition. DS's touchscreen functionality allows for intuitive inventory management and other useful features in this ability, which allows to skip dialogue scenes, similar to the PC version. Loading door screens can also be skipped. The knife, unlike in previous versions, does not occupy an inventory slot and can be used at any time. A quick 180-degree turn, which was not possible in the original Resident Evil, is now available by pressing the run button and down on the D-pad. A quick reload function has also been added, removing the need to manually combine ammo with a weapon. A few minor but interesting details include changes to the piano playing sequence, which now stops the music partially like the PC release. Additionally, the save room theme has a different tone compared to other releases. A bizarre yet amusing feature is the ability to use a touchscreen to touch characters in awkward places, not just Jill but Chris as well. Even a pinch on the bottom is acknowledged. Rebirth mode introduces several new mechanics. If a zombie grabs a player, they can mash buttons or use the touchscreen to break free. Room layouts have also been altered. For example, the mirror room before the changing room now reflects the character, similar to the Director's Cut Advanced mode. The changing room itself features costumes exclusive to the DS version in Classic mode. Only the original unlockable costumes are available, whereas Rebirth mode grants access to new outfits. Jill receives a sexy cop uniform, whilst Chris gets a ninja outfit. If Chris wears the ninja outfit, Rebecca appears in a cheerleader costume, with her knife replaced by a pom-pom. You still have the chance to one-headshot zombies, and the DS version features a first-person mode, sometimes when you enter rooms where you can use the pen or touchscreen to swipe the zombies with your knife attacks, and parry for stronger attacks. The game compensates you for the difficulty of this by giving the player essential items. Other gameplay adjustments in Rebirth mode include increased enemy variation, with more creatures appearing in certain rooms. New puzzles have also been introduced, making use of the DS's microphone and stylus. Some treasure chests now require stylus interactions to open, and existing puzzles have been modified to incorporate these new mechanics. For example, instead of the clock in the dining room automatically chiming when the gold emblem is placed, players must manually wind it. Similarly, after saving Richard with the serum, players must use the microphone to perform CPR on him. If he survives, he even provides a clue to wind the clock to a different time for additional items. Deadly Silence includes 2 extra game modes beyond the main campaign. The first, Master of Knifing, is unlocked upon completing the game and references Jill's infamous Master of Unlocking line. This mode is a series of rooms where players must defeat enemies using only a knife, similar to Battle mode on the Sega Saturn. The touchscreen is used for slashing, while the microphone can be used to counter projectile attacks. As in the main game, Chris mode is more challenging than Jill's. Completing Master of Knifing unlocks Wesker as a playable character in the final mode, Multicard mode. Multicard mode introduces multiplayer functionality, complete with its own unique music. If multiple players have copies of the game, they can choose between a cooperative campaign where all the players share a life bar and must escape together, or a competitive mode, where the goal is to reach the objective first. Several locations from the game are available as playable maps. Additionally, each character has unique voice lines when selected, adding an extra charm to the multiplayer experience. In conclusion, Deadly Silence is a fascinating take on the original game, leveraging the Nintendo DS's unique hardware features in creative ways. While its graphical limitations hold it back from being the definitive version, its new mechanics and touchscreen interactivity and bonus content make it a must-play for fans of the classic Resident Evil experience. As we briefly touched on earlier in the video, Capcom originally intended to release a port of Resident Evil for the Game Boy Color. However, this never officially happened. Instead, a fan recreation of these concepts can be found online, playable on cartridges or PC. Despite its presentation suffering from technical limitations, this is a well-made interpretation of Resident Evil. The famous Resident Evil voice plays at the beginning when the menu appears. Upon selecting either New Game or Continue, players can still choose between Chris or Jill. The game even features the opening cutscene, though it is presented with subtitles instead of spoken dialogue. The music differs from the original, with only one track playing throughout the entire game. Some things were removed to make this version playable, such as most of the objects in the dining room, allowing for easier movement. The turnaround zombie scene is represented by a single screenshot, and zombies drop to their knees instead of fully collapsing when killed. Despite these limitations, this game unmistakably retains the essence of Resident Evil. There is a decent scaling to show the depths in various camera shots, which change when focusing on specific items such as the emblem in the dining room. The game also retains classic transitions such as door opening and stair climbing animations, as well as idle animations. It remains possible too to move objects, such as the stairs in the statue room on the first floor. The status and inventory screens are faithfully replicated, though manipulating 3D objects is not an option. This limitation primarily affects the Doom books, where in the original, players had to rotate them to find the medals. In this version, simply clicking the check button reveals them. Interestingly, in addition to pausing the game through the inventory screen, this version has a unique pause screen, featuring a STARS logo. Players also have infinite ammo for any equipped gun. And to my knowledge, this game is incomplete. It appears to be about 90% finished, but at a certain point, progressing further requires cheats or emulator manipulations. Even if one reaches the elevator that leads to the final encounter in the lab and powers it on, the game will state that the elevator has no power, rendering the last few rooms inaccessible. The only enemies encountered are the zombies, with the exception of Yawn, which only appears in the first encounter room but does not move at all. Despite these limitations, nearly all character cutscenes and puzzles seem to be present. While this game remains incomplete and was never officially released by Capcom, it stands as one of the most ambitious Game Boy Color games and ports of all time. The attention to detail and the ways in which the locations are navigated are truly impressive. An early version of this port was also surfaced, appearing to be some sort of test copy. In this version, only Chris is playable, even if Jill is selected. Chris starts with a map and a shotgun, however after collecting the emblem, it becomes impossible to check the hollow recess where it once was, suggesting that part of the programming had not been completed. Finding pieces like this offers a fascinating glimpse into what could have been an official release of Resident Evil on the Game Boy Color. By far, the 2002 GameCube remake is arguably the best version of Resident Evil. Not only does it look more visually appealing, but the overall game quality has also dramatically improved. Gone are the clunky tank control movements, except when aiming a gun. The auto-aim system is reminiscent of the director's cut in the Japanese original, but not the Western version, making aiming much easier. Right from the start, players can choose between Chris or Jill and select their desired difficulty, including hard mode after completing the game. The attention to detail is absolutely outstanding, with amazing lighting effects and vastly improved cutscenes. Most cutscenes are now skippable and feature enhanced visuals. However, the FMV cutscenes of the first encounter to the mansion is no longer the same as what it was on the PlayStation 1, because whilst yes they roughly remain the same dialogue wise and still retain the desperate need to seek refuge into the mansion, the HD version is far less graphic than the live FMV cutscenes. Plus, in the intro, the commentator, whilst explaining the horrific murders from the people in Raccoon City, is presented different too. In the original, we see a member of the Bravo team mutilated, but in the HD version, we see a newscast instead. Interestingly as well, as the Alpha team make their way to the mansion in the HD version, Wesker saves Chris from being attacked by a dog.
Hey, Brad! Where the hell's he going? Chris, this way.
Interestingly, the first zombie encounter is less horrific, as Kenneth's body is more intact with no decapitation, just a pool of blood. And uniquely though, players can find a videotape on Kenneth and go into a lab showing what Kenneth saw before he died, a concept later borrowed by the future titles.
Get away from me! No! Hey! No!
Stop it! Don't open that door!
What is it? What is this?
What is it?
Blood.
So yes, it's time to address the elephant in the room. The hilarious bad voice acting in the original Resident Evil in 1996, which sounded like one of those cheesy, corny cartoon programs that speaks to the audience almost in a condescendingly but funnily way, trying to explain something that we can already gather is happening.
Whoa! This hall is dangerous. There must be a back door somewhere. Let's try to find it first, shall we? Just a moment. I found something.
What is it?
It's a weapon.
Now, this kind of oddly reminds me of Dora the Explorer. Now, hold on, I know what you're thinking. I don't watch Dora the Explorer. I have flicked the TV channel a few times and just, occasionally browsed the TV to see what's on, and it just awfully reminded me of this.
Uh-oh, the gate's locked. How are we going to open the gate?
I know. My daddy built this gate to help me learn my shapes. To open the garden gate, you have to stand on the triangle. But watch out! If you stand on the wrong shape, you go flying up into the trees. Okay, all I have to do is step on the triangle.
Uh-oh, it's King Quan and Bubba standing on the triangle? What's he standing on?
So you get what I mean. It's almost as if Capcom forgot their audience were adults that were playing this game, not children.
Don't worry. I'll just go and get some fresh air and be eaten by a monster. Don't come this way! No!
The truth is, it's the result of a perfect storm of budget constraints, rush production, and some baffling localization choices and context. The game's titled robotic and often unintentionally comedic dialogue you've seen become legendary in its gaming history has given us infamous lines like "You was almost a Jill sandwich" and "I hope this is not Chris's blood." The funny story behind it is that Resident Evil was developed on a tight schedule, and Capcom outsourced the English voice acting to a small recording studio in Japan. Instead of hiring professional actors, they used non-union voice talent, many of whom were expats living in Japan. The recording sessions were rushed with little to no direction, leading to awkward and unnatural line deliveries. And according to some reports, the English script was incomplete or even lost during recording, forcing the actors to improvise or read poorly translated lines directly. This resulted in bizarre phrasing and robotic delivery, as the actors were likely unsure of the context behind their lines. Plus, the original Japanese script was roughly translated into English without much refinement. Since there was no native English speaker overseeing the translation, the dialogue remained unnatural and stilted. Instead of sounding like real conversations like between me and you, the lines were delivered with strange pacing and bizarre word choices. Seems oddly familiar to a game in Elder Scrolls.
How are you?
Been better. How about you?
Not bad.
Good to hear. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
What was originally a flaw became a part of the game's charm. The over-the-top robotic performances gave Resident Evil a campy B-movie horror feel, which fans have come to love. Capcom eventually improved voice acting in later titles, but the original remains iconic for its unintentional comedy. To this day, the Resident Evil voice acting is referenced in memes, parodies, and even official Capcom promotions. It's a case of bad being so bad that it's good. But in the GameCube and HD version of Resident Evil, the voice acting has vastly improved, which makes the horror experience far more immersive as the context of the scenarios now match the tone of the game.
Stop it! Don't open that door!
Jill, no. You don't want to go back out there.
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
You're right. Barry, thanks for saving my life.
That was a close one. A second late, you would have fit nicely into a sandwich.
Really? Thanks.
I think you'd better take a look at this.
What is it?
Blood. Jill, see if you can find any other clues. I'll be examining this. Let's just hope it's not Chris's.
So there's quite a lot of differences in the GameCube version and the HD remaster, such as the mansion layout. The mansion itself is completely altered, with more puzzles, a graveyard from the original concepts, and a door on the staircase in the middle that wasn't actually in the original. There was even early access to other doors in this remake. Players can access outdoor areas earlier compared to the original, as well as being able to climb stairs without any loading screens, which is a welcome addition. Plus, the typewriter location, which was usually in the main hall, is actually in the dining room instead. And another great feature about the remaster, which ironically should be called a remake considering it's been completely remade, is the defensive items. If you pick them up, they can be such things as knives in Jill's case, where they can be used to ward off zombies, giving you a chance to step back and reassess your approach. In both cases, usually Chris and Jill can use these defensive items, such as the defensive taser as well. And if you land a perfect headshot and decapitate the zombie, you can actually require your knife back. In Chris's case, it's a little bit different. He uses grenades, which usually just instantly decapitates the zombie straight away. The lady statue room has had a complete overhaul too, whilst retaining its originality. Instead of moving steps this time, instead we use some drawers that are also in the original game, that lead to that secret room behind the statue. The drawers are still in the original game, but to access the actual statue and to get the map, you need to use the stairs. And now, dogs burst through the window when returning to the hall, whereas in the original, this is triggered regardless of the player's route, but usually the first time you enter the room, they burst out the windows. Reloading is far more seamless and a lot better this time round, a bit like the director's cut, but you don't have to combine ammo. As long as you've got ammo in your inventory, you can actually press one of the buttons to actually put a new mag into your gun. Really effective stuff. Movement while still retaining the tank controls and the very awkward camera angles to add the horror, it's far more effective this time. It's easier to move around with the thumbsticks in rotation rather than feeling a bit robotic like it did on the PS1, as well as being able to do one quick 180 turns if needed. The lighter is actually a lot more useful in the remaster, aside from being used to reveal hidden items, unlike the original where it provided the second floor map or the candle room which would give you some ammo, but in the original it was actually pretty much useless. In the remake, however, it's far more important, because a part of the puzzle in the remaster actually requires you to use a lighter to find a musical score for the Moonlight Sonata puzzle to give you the golden emblem. The entire scene has been beautifully reworked, and the symphony and song ends just as it should when Jill stops playing the piano, the door opens, and we can grab the emblem. Now you can pretty much use a lighter anytime you want thanks to the kerosene tanks you find around the game, provided you have the flask from the safe room. Speaking of which, the safe room theme has a more refined tune compared to the original game, maintaining that sense of urgency while still offering a temporary feeling of safety. The melody is on point. Whilst the remaster does not have the exact soundtrack as the original PS1 version, and thankfully not the director's cut DualShock version, the remaster has many of the same songs from the original PS1, but just reimagined and modernised. I mean, they're not exactly identical, but they really do fit well. With the lighter and kerosene flask in hand, you can use them to outright kill zombies you shot. Unlike the original game where corpses would vanish after you killed them, the bodies remain in the remaster. And if left unchecked for a certain amount of time, these corpses will turn into crimson heads, a new element not present in the previous entries. The creatures are far more ruthless, faster, and deal significantly more damage. The idea is to burn the bodies once you've downed a zombie to ensure they stay dead for good, because rooms full of crimsons are bad news. It's usually the best bet to give the zombie the double tap on the floor to make sure they're dead, otherwise if you try to set them on fire they might stand up again. Since you can't rely on the grenade launcher with Chris, it's a good idea to be sparing with the fuel canister. But as for Jill, she's got the grenade launcher. Yes, you guessed it. Still found on Forrester's body. The location where you find the grenade launcher is more fleshed out. And just like in the director's cut, Forrest actually gets up and tries to attack you if you go to a particular spot in that area. And as you know, there are many different types of grenade launcher shells, each effective against certain enemy types, like acid rounds for Yawn and Hunters, and incendiary rounds for Crimson Heads. Which, by the way, aside from the bosses from the previous entries, there's a new one, George Trevor himself. He's the father of his estranged daughter and a test subject for Mr. Spencer's Umbrella Corporation, Lisa Trevor. Anyway, instead of collecting 4 crests like in the original, this time around you collect 4 death masks in the mansion. Once placed in position, you fight a Crimson Head boss, who's presumed to be George Trevor, though don't quote me on that one. After defeating him, you'll find a stone and a metal object in the coffin, a crucial item for progressing to the top of the underground mines located beneath the mansion stairs. This area wasn't accessible in the original game, where you simply went through a waterfall, which you still do in the remaster, but the 2 metal objects are an additional piece that adds to the puzzles and the lore of the remaster, and some of the backstory of Lisa Trevor and her tragic history. In the original, upon entering the mines, you immediately meet Barry. That's assuming after you've killed Yawn for the first time in the gramophone room. Barry shows up and helps you down the hole on the ground with a rope. Then he lets the rope fall and he says it was an accident and asks you to wait because he'll be back with some other rope.
Wait, I'll go and get another rope.
Barry? Barry!
But then you just have to wait, and if you do, he will come back with another rope, and in doing so, he'll be in the tunnels helping you later. If not, unfortunately, you'll get the bad ending. It's one of the most crucial points in the original game. Often that something could get easily overlooked, and I did it in my first playthrough. You just gotta have to wait a few seconds for him to arrive, and once he does, he should be with you for the rest of the game. By the time you make it into the mines or the tunnels, you will have to go with Barry. You can either let him go first or have him follow you. Either way, ensuring this happens will make sure that it will be with you for the rest of the game. But out of experience, it's best if you take the lead and don't let Barry go first.
Oh, Jill, what good timing. A moment ago I heard someone's voice coming from this hole. Let's go together since it's dark and we can't see very well.
Okay, let's go.
Okay, then I'm gonna cover you. Let's hurry. Hey, are you all right? I can go first if you want me to.
Okay, let's go, Barry. I'm depending on you.
But in the remaster, you encounter him later, near the elevator. Also, whilst navigating through the mines in the original, you don't come across Lisa Trevor like you do in the remaster. Instead, in the original, after completing the mines, you take an elevator that leads directly to the fountain where the lab is located, shortening the actual gameplay. However, in the remaster, you need to backtrack from Lisa Trevor's shack, with the stone and metal emblems you collected from the guardhouse and the pieces required for the second emblem to unlock the door under the mansion stairs. Here you face Lisa Trevor in a boss battle.
No time to talk. Jill, hand me my gun! Thanks, Jill.
This fight is really interesting since Barry is under Wesker's orders at this point. You can choose to give his gun back to him when Lisa arrives, allowing him to help you defeat her, or otherwise he's unarmed and can actually die.
Barry!
Resulting in the bad ending. The battle itself is unique because you can push off concrete stones that open Lisa Trevor's mother's tomb, prompting a cutscene where she grabs her mother's skull and jumps off the top of the mines. It's interesting to note that Barry can be pushed off the platform as well, aside from the concrete blocks, which actually open up an exit for you and him to escape. Moments like this are reminiscent of the earlier parts of both the original and the remaster of Resident Evil, where the route you take at the start significantly impacts the events that unfold. For example, in the shotgun trap room, Barry may or may not come to your rescue depending on your earlier choices. If you triggered a specific event beforehand, like receiving acid rounds from him, he won't appear to save you. To trigger his intervention, you need to attempt to open both doors in the trap room. If you miss the timing or sequence, Barry won't show up, leaving you to deal with the trap on your own. This can be tricky to figure out and may take a few playthroughs to fully understand the pattern. Alternatively, the broken shotgun can be used to replace the hanging shotgun in the Spencer Mansion first floor east lounge, allowing the player to obtain the weapon without activating the falling ceiling trap. When playing as Chris, using the broken shotgun is the only way to bypass the trap, because Barry won't be there to help you, I suppose. However, if you're playing as Jill and Barry doesn't assist her due to her earlier events, she too is forced to rely on the broken shotgun. This design encourages strategic thinking and planning, especially as Jill, where the goal is often to reach the shotgun trap room as soon as possible to trigger Barry's rescue. The brilliance of Resident Evil Remaster lies in how it stays true to the original while making smart changes that enhance the gameplay. In Chris's playthrough, the first encounter with Rebecca is notably different. In the PS1 original version, Chris meets Rebecca in the save room where the serum is stored. However, in the remaster, the first meeting happens in the attic room where Richard is dying from the Yawn's bite.
Don't talk. He's
seems to have been bitten by a poisonous snake, but the size of the bite mark is huge. I'm gonna give you a shot now, Richard. Hang in there.
This change alters the flow of the events significantly. In the PS1 version, Richard dies regardless of whenever you get the serum on time, whenever you're playing as Jill or Chris, but in the remaster things are different. As Jill, if you bring the serum fast enough, Richard will help you during the yawn battle and sacrifices himself to save her, dropping an assault shotgun that can be collected afterwards.
Jill!
In Chris's playthrough, Richard can also be saved by delivering the serum in time. If you do, Richard later appears in the Neptune tank room, where he jumps in front of a shark to protect Chris, which is entirely new to the remaster. These changes add a new dynamic to the gameplay experience the PS1 didn't offer.
Richard! Chris! Chris, stop! No! Richard.
Aside from this, certain scenes remain the same, like when Rebecca screams for help in the reading room. In the older version, she simply just runs off after being rescued, but in the remaster, Chris wants her to be more careful and they agree to meet later.
Rebecca.
Chris!
You okay?
I didn't mean to get you worried.
We can't stay here any longer. We have to get to the others and find a way out of here. You with me?
Yes.
Then I'll go ahead. Until then, Rebecca, you're on your own. Stay cool and use your better judgment. Got it?
I can handle myself.
Good luck.
However, Rebecca's survival isn't guaranteed. Just like Barry, she can die depending on the player's actions. Not just from the Hunter attack, but also during the Tyrant boss battle at the heliport. Overall, the remaster keeps the core elements intact, but makes strategic changes that really enhance your experience. A lot has changed in the remaster. Not just in terms of the visuals, but in how the puzzles and locations are approached. For example, remember how the chemicals used to destroy the plant in the mansion's fountain? In the original, you'd find it in the East Store room, essentially a safe room, but in the remaster, its location has been completely reimagined. Now you discover it in an outdoor area. And for those who remember the wind crest that unlocked the shed leading to the guardhouse and beyond, its purpose has been completely reimagined in the remaster. In the original, you'd find the wind crest in the room with the tiger statue that required the blue gemstone. In return, you'd receive the crest to progress. However, in the remaster, that same room rewards you with shotgun ammo instead. The crests themselves have been removed and replaced with the stone metal objects. Now, the wind crest, which you find in the researcher's private room, leads you to a graveyard, drawing from the original Resident Evil's concept art. This graveyard holds a new puzzle where you collect the Sun Crest, Moon Crest and Star Crest, something that we used on the original. Once you solve this puzzle, you're awarded with the Magnum. It's very similar to Barry's gun, but maybe not as powerful. However, like for example, if you decide to take Barry's gun in Lisa Trevor's fight, you can practically one-hit the Tyrant with it. Now, maybe I'm reaching here since the game came out long before the later titles, but honestly, Resident Evil has proven to inspire future entries in the series. Take the researcher's private quarters for example. There's a bed you can examine that says these footprints look like they're going through them. To me, this feels like a subtle nod or perhaps an idea that was later expanded upon in Resident Evil 7's banned footage DLC, specifically in the bedroom escape sequence. The knight statue puzzle is different in the remaster. You have to push the corresponding knights in the right order so they all hit the wall. Doing this gives you a key item. However, in the original, it was much simpler. You just moved the knight onto the poison gas grate and hit the button and you was good to go. The Neptune tank area is just as suspenseful as the original, but now looks even more haunting. The shark encounter is far more intense with added platforms that make it more daunting to navigate. The sharks are twice the size, especially Neptune itself.
Emergency.
There's a different dynamic this time around because unlike before where you could just hit a switch to drain the tank, now there's a timed countdown puzzle. You have to drain the water whilst keeping Neptune from breaking in and ultimately killing you. The plan of action usually is to make sure that the shutters are shut down. The gallery room has had a complete overhaul. The room's layout and puzzle are significantly different, although the core concept remains intact. This time, instead of receiving a crest, solving the puzzle opens a secret shutter door leading to an outside area in the remaster. The defensive weapon is exclusive to the remaster, acting like a one-shot magnum. It's powerful, comparable to Barry's magnum in terms of impact, but don't expect it to one-shot a boss. However, if you manage to find more rounds, it can take down a boss pretty quickly. It's especially effective against hunters in crucial moments, so saving it for tough encounters is a smart move. A cool detail in the game is the more disc readers. In the original version they look like simple readers you'd slot a disc into. However, in the GameCube version the disc readers actually resembles GameCubes. The MO disc reader in the HD version no longer looks the same as the GameCube, although the wires coming out the part still hint at it being sort of designed around the GameCube version still. On the GameCube, if you beat the game in under 5 hours, you unlock the Samurai Edge pistol for both characters. It has infinite ammo and can fire 3 shots in rapid succession. You also get a rocket launcher for finishing the game in under 3 hours, but it's different from the one used in the final boss fight. This version can be aimed up and down and kills everything in one hit, except zombies still need to be burned as they're not obliterated like in the original game. This means Crimson heads can still get back up. As for costumes, Chris and Jill have 2 new outfits. Beat the game once to get the closet key and the first costume, then beat it again for the second. The changing room now is at the start of the game behind a painting in the hallway past the statue with the map. Jill's first encounter is combat style clothing, while her second primary outfit is from Resident Evil 3. Chris gets streetwear as his first and his Code Veronica uniform as his second. Rebecca also gets a new cowgirl outfit with Chris's costumes. They're all new game modes too. Beating the game once on normal difficulty unlocks Real Survival mode, which is absolutely brutal. It's set to hard and auto aim is removed, and item boxes are no longer linked. If you want something from the box, you need to remember where you left it. Beating Real Survival mode or finishing the game twice on any difficulty unlocks Invisible Enemy mode, and in this mode, enemies are completely invisible, except in 2 situations. They fade into view when they grab you, and reflect in puddles or mirrors. Seeing an invisible enemy's reflection for the first time can be really unsettling. The final unlockable permanently changes the game and there's no way to turn it off. If you want to avoid it, you will need to start a new file. It's called One Tough Zombie. Remember Forrest Spray, the Dead Star member on the 2nd floor? In the normal game, he only attacks if you pass him to get a healing item. But in One Tough Zombie, he is not there at all. That's because he is roaming around the mansion. He shows up in several preset areas, making your life a nightmare. Forrest moves as fast as a Crimson Head, but he dies in 1 hit. Sounds easy, right? But there's only one problem. He's covered in grenades. If he goes down, you're going down with him. You can't get in a fight with him. Because if he grabs you, just let him bite you, because fighting back is an instant game over. Good luck avoiding him, or better yet, hope he doesn't find you. When comparing the remaster to the original remake, there's some notable differences. First, the main menu offers more options. You can view a digital manual, check out the gallery for unlocked ending cutscenes, and even compare speedrun times online leaderboards. There's also the ability to set the language and subtitles. A new difficulty level called Very Easy is available from the start, making things more forgiving. Ink ribbon pickups are worth 6 instead of the usual 3, and when starting a new game you can choose your character's costume right away, while the classic unlockable costumes still require you to beat the game. On a New Game Plus you can select them from the beginning. The changing room is still there, but the remaster adds 2 brand new costumes for Chris and Jill. BSAA outfits from Resident Evil 5 which are available even on a new file. During gameplay, you can also adjust the display mode, showing the developer's attention to modernising the experience whilst respecting the original's design. When you unlock a new weapon or mode in Resident Evil, the caption text has undergone changes. Take the Samurai Edge for example. In the GameCube version, when you unlock it, it simply reads, "Chris and Jill now have this." This is a subtle nod to the famous line from the original Resident Evil.
But how about you, Barry?
I have this.
However, in the remastered version of the game, the text is updated to tell you that you've unlocked Barry's custom Samurai Edge, and it adds the details. It's really powerful. Definitely a nod to the original game.
What is it?
It's a weapon. It's really powerful.
Another change comes at the end of the game. In the original versions of the remake, when you finish, the screen fades into a still image of your character with a display showing how long it took to beat the game. It's simple, yet effective. However, the remastered version adds some flair to this by having your character pan in front of the background instead of fading into it. The end screen itself also received more detailed information, in addition to showing your final time. You now see how much ammo, how many ink ribbons and how many health items you've used throughout the game. It's a more comprehensive view of your journey. Perhaps the most striking difference in the remaster is how the character background works in the original. The background would remain static, but now depending on what costume you were wearing when you completed the game, the image of your character will reflect that specific costume. Finally, when it comes to the Wii port of Resident Evil, it's nearly identical to the GameCube version, so there isn't a whole lot to discuss. However, there are a few notable differences worth mentioning. The first is the graphical improvement. While the GameCube version ran at 40 AI, the Wii version bumps that up about 480p, offering a slightly crisper visual experience. In addition to the GameCube controller, you can use the Wii Remote, a combination of the Wii Remote and Nunchuk, or the classic controller. Finally, toward the end of the game, when you went to the lab in the GameCube version, you're prompted to switch to disc 2. The Wii version, however, is just on one disc, so the gameplay is seamless at this part. So that's really all there is to talk about when it comes to Resident Evil. Resident Evil has forever changed how we've experienced horror games, from its humble beginnings to the groundbreaking remakes that have allowed us to relive the experience with a fresh perspective. There's no denying that Resident Evil is where it all began for so many of us. It marked the start of a legacy that continues to captivate and terrify, a legacy that stood the test of time and is etched into the very fabric of gaming history. Thanks to this game, the Resident Evil series evolved into one of the most beloved and iconic franchises ever created. While it may not be the favourite of every fan, there's something deeply special about it for those of us who were there from the beginning. I, like so many others, consider this game to be the best in the entire series, and if I had to choose a version, I'd pick the HD remaster without hesitation. The way it enhances an experience while still preserving the essence of the original is nothing short of brilliant. It not only breathes new life into the game, but it brings back the concepts that were once scrapped, giving us the answers we've all been craving about the mansion and the mysteries within. It's a testament to Resident Evil's enduring brilliance, how it constantly evolves while honouring its roots. The remaster gave us more than just a polished version, it offered a deeper connection to the story and the characters, filling in those gaps we've wondered about for all those years. So with all that being said, thank you all so much for watching. If you've enjoyed this video, make sure to hit that like button, and if you're new to the channel, consider subscribing. I'm the VoiceBox, and until we meet again, and remember, keep on surviving.